The needle slipped, drew a bead of blood, and Miriam did not flinch. Past midnight in the Strickland house on Grosvenor Square, a single tallow candle guttered on the sewing table. Miriam Verney, 22, bent over a gown of pale rose silk that did not belong to her. Pink petals of artificial silk lay scattered across her lap like fallen leaves. Above her, Miss Cassandra Strickland yawned into a glove and ordered the seams finished before dawn, because Lord Marbury might glance her way at the next assembly. Miriam inclined her head. She said nothing. Beneath the coarse brown wool of her bodice, against her ribs, a silver signet ring on a black ribbon pressed cold against her skin. The ring bore the crest of a viscount whose name no drawing-room in London now dared to speak. 3 days later, in a quiet back room of Maison Dufresne in Bond Street, the French modiste pressed a folded paper into her palm. Black wax, a single initial, M. That night, beneath a loose floorboard in her attic, Miriam lifted away the dust and found a sealed box she had never seen before. What waited inside that box, and the name written on the paper, would carry a plain girl in brown wool toward the largest chandelier in Devonshire House. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The tallow candle guttered, and Miriam Verney did not look up. She set another stitch into the hem of the rose silk, her needle moving with the patience of a woman who had long ago stopped counting hours. The wax dripped onto the brass holder, hissed and pooled. Outside the third-floor window of the Strickland house on Grosvenor Square, March rain struck the slates in a thin, sliding rhythm. Inside the small sewing room, the air smelled of cold wax, of damp wool, and faintly of the lavender water Cassandra used too generously on her wrists. It was the year of our Lord 1818, and Miriam was 22, and she had not been called by her family name in 3 years. Her fingers were narrow and pale, the second knuckle of the right index swollen from the same needle, the same silk, the same endless petals. She wore mittens of beige knit cut at the joints, a Spanish brown wool gown she had turned twice, a linen apron washed soft, and a gray shawl drawn close at the shoulders. Beneath the high collar of her bodice, against the slow heat of her skin, the silver signet of the Verneys hung on a black ribbon, the seal turned inward so that no one passing might glimpse the shape of it. She heard the carriage before she heard the voice. Wheels on wet stone, the bark of a footman, then Cassandra Strickland already complaining as she crossed the hall. Higher, you fool. Lifted higher, the satin will mark. A pause, the slither of slippers on the stair. Where is the wretched girl? Bring her down. No, leave her. I shall go up myself. Miriam set the needle into the cushion. She rose, smoothed the apron, and was already at the door when Cassandra struck it open from the other side. The debutante was small, scarcely past 19, and beautiful in the brittle way of a thing too newly polished. Her hair had been crimped that afternoon into pale ringlets that bobbed as she breathed. Her eyes were a small, close blue. The rose taffeta gown rustled with each step, and the false peach petals at the bodice had begun to droop in the damp. Look at it. She thrust the skirt forward. 3 of them already loose. 3, before I have even reached the carriage. What sort of work is this? Miriam took the silk between her fingers. The petals had not loosened. Cassandra had pulled at them in the carriage out of habit, the way she pulled at any object she could not eat. Miriam said only, I shall set them again, Miss Strickland. You shall set them all again. Every one. Cassandra turned a slow circle in the center of the room, as if it were a ballroom. I want 100 petals at the hem, not these scrawny things. Mamma says the Duchess of Devonshire will wear hers crowded so thick a man might lose his hand in them, and what the Duchess wears in April every other woman wishes she had worn in March. It will take the night. Then it will take the night. Miriam inclined her head. She did not lower her eyes. That was the small economy of pride she had not yet been able to spend. Cassandra noticed and did not like it. She drifted to the window and pressed her gloved palm to the glass. Lord Marbury may look tomorrow, she said, the words half to the rain. Mamma heard it from Lady Sefton, who heard it from the man himself. The Earl of Alnwick is to call at Strickland House before noon. Imagine, the Ice Lord at our door, and I in mourning for last season's lace. The needle paused in Miriam's hand. It was the smallest movement, the breadth of a hair, and she resumed before any eye less watchful than her own would have marked it. Lord Marbury, the Earl of Alnwick. She had read the name in the morning papers as she carried the tray to the breakfast room, and she had read it again in the court circular she pressed for Lady Honoria's scrapbook, and she had told herself each time that the name belonged to a stranger. He never calls anywhere, Cassandra was saying. Not since Spain, not since the cold took whatever it took from him. They say he danced with no one all last season, not even Lady Augusta, and she is the prettiest match in England. But he will call tomorrow. He will call here, and he will see me. She turned from the window. So you will sew until dawn, do you hear me? 100 petals. And then you will press my mother's pelisse, and then you will do my hair before the toilette. If I look weary tomorrow, Miriam, I shall know whom to thank. You will not look weary, Miss Strickland. I had better not. Cassandra swept out, and the door, ill hung since the autumn, swung half-closed behind her, and stayed half-closed. Miriam waited until the slippers had reached the lower landing, until a second door shut somewhere below. Then she crossed the room in 3 quiet steps and pressed her fingers to her own breastbone, where the silver seal lay cool against her ribs. She did not weep. She had not wept in this house for the better part of a year. She returned to the chair. She lit a second candle from the first, because Lady Honoria counted the stubs but not the new ones, and she began again upon the hem. Outside, the rain shifted from a slide to a drumming, and inside, the petals multiplied beneath her hand. 100 petals. She set the first dozen swiftly, the way a woman who knows her work sets a thing she has done before. She kept her shoulders down. She did not let the back round. Lady Verney, dead these 11 years, would have set the same stitch in the same room of Verney House on Half Moon Street, and she would have done it with a straight back, and so her daughter did it with a straight back also. By the time the small clock on the mantel struck 11, Miriam had counted 37 petals into the silk, and her thumb had bled twice into the apron, and she had bound the thumb with a strip of linen torn from the inside seam of her own shift, so that the blood would not reach the gown. A step on the stair, heavy, slow, dragging the right foot. She knew the step before she lifted her head. Sir Reginald Strickland came in without knocking. He brought with him the warm, sweet stench of port and the colder stench of cigar, and beneath both the dry note of the racing form he carried folded in his fist. His waistcoat was unbuttoned at the lowest. His face had darkened from its usual wine to something nearer plum. "Still at it?" he said, and laughed without humor. Good girl. My daughter requires diligence. My household requires diligence. We are very fond of diligence in this house." Miriam set another stitch. He came no closer. He stopped instead by the small writing table where Cassandra had once practiced her hand and now did not, and he set the racing form down upon it. And he lifted a candle to read it again, as though he had not read it 9 times already that evening. His fingers shook a little against the paper. Miriam saw the shake, and she saw also the new ring upon his smallest finger, which had not been there yesterday, and would not be there the day after, for Sir Reginald's rings travelled to and from the pawnbroker in Vere Street with the regularity of the post. "Newmarket," he said, to no one. "Newmarket in 3 weeks. A man could remake himself at Newmarket, if he had the head for it. A man could undo a great deal." Miriam said nothing. She had learned that silence cost less than reply. He turned then, slowly, as if remembering she was in the room. His eyes moved over her as they always moved, with the lazy, careless looking over of a man considering a piece of stock. "You're a useful creature," he said. "I'll give Honoria that. She picked a useful one. The other girl ate too much and broke a saucer. You eat nothing and break nothing. You are a model of economy." "Thank you, Sir Reginald." "Don't thank me." A small laugh again. "It is not a kindness. It is a fact." He drifted out. The smell of him stayed longer than he did, the way a smear of grease stays after a hand is lifted. Miriam waited. She counted 10 breaths. Then she rose and crossed to the door and pulled it fully shut, and she turned the small iron key, and only then did she go to the loose board beneath the truckle bed in the corner. She did not lift it. She only pressed her palm against the floor above it, the way one presses a palm to the cover of a Bible, to swear by something one cannot say aloud. Beneath that board lay 3 things. A miniature of her father, painted the year before Salamanca, a single yellowed letter in her mother's hand, sent from Verney Hall the spring she died, and a small canvas bag of 17 guineas, saved over 36 months from the half-crowns Lady Honoria gave her at Christmas, and the shillings Sir Reginald sometimes forgot in his coat pockets when he came home drunk. 17 guineas. It would not take her far. It would take her, she had calculated, as far as a hired chair to Dover and a steerage passage to Calais and a month's lodging in a respectable house where a young Englishwoman, with passable French and a steady hand at needlework, might find honest employment as a seamstress for a French modiste who did not ask questions. She had calculated this many times. She had not yet bought the chair. The reason, when she allowed herself to name it, was the seal. To leave England with the silver still warm against her skin was to leave the name with her. To leave the name was to leave her father unburied a second time. A woman might run from a house. A daughter could not run from a crest, so she stayed, and she stitched, and she waited for a sign she could not yet describe, only recognize when it came. Her uncle had told her once, in the only conversation they had been permitted since the calumny of 1815, that patience was a Verney virtue. He had set it across the small tea table in his Bloomsbury parlor, with his white side whiskers trembling slightly and his blue eyes full of water. "Wait, child," he had said. "Wait as your grandfather waited at Quebec. Wait as your father waited the night before he was struck down in the house. There is a tide that comes for a name even after the name has gone under. Be standing when it comes." She had been 17 then. She was 22 now. She had been standing 5 years. She rose from the floor. She unlocked the door. She returned to the chair and to the gown and to the petals. By the small hours, the candle had been replaced a second time, and the rain had stopped, and the only sound in the house was the slow ticking of the clock on the mantel and the slow movement of her thread through silk. She did not look at the window, but she felt the dark of it. The sky beyond was the blue-black of the hour that has no name, the hour between night and dawn, when even the milk carts have not yet begun upon the cobbles. She thought, briefly, of her father. She thought of him as she always thought of him, in profile, in the great chamber of the House of Lords, his hand laid flat upon the rail as he rose to speak. The portrait at Verney Hall had shown him in that pose. She had been 11 the day they sold the portrait. The auctioneer had clapped his small hammer down, and a stout man from Manchester had carried her father out of the drawing-room under one arm as though he were a length of carpet. She set another petal. She did not allow the thought to soften her shoulders. A board creaked in the corridor. She did not lift her head. The creak passed, faded, did not return. The house at this hour was full of such creaks. The Stricklands had bought a fine house and could not afford to maintain it, and so the boards complained as boards do when no one cares to oil the joists. At 3:30 by the mantel clock, the 100th petal went down. She knotted the thread close, bit it free, and sat for a moment with the silk loose across her lap. Her shoulders, at last, lowered an inch. Then she rose, shook out the gown, and hung it from the dressmaker's form in the corner, so that the petals would not crush before morning. She straightened the brown wool of her own skirt. She blew out the candle. She let her eyes adjust to the gray that was just beginning at the window, and only when she could see the outline of her own hand did she lift it to her breastbone and slip the silver seal out from beneath the linen. It was the size of a small coin, worn smooth on the back from her father's thumb, sharp still on the face where the crest stood, a hawk above 3 crowns, and beneath, in small letters that no one could now read without a glass, the words, Veritas vincit, truth conquers. She did not know whether she still believed it. She knew only that she still wore it. She tucked it back beneath the ribbon. She unlocked the door. She went down the back stair without a candle, by counting steps, and she reached the kitchen as the cook's girl was raking the first ashes from the range. "You're up early, miss," the girl said, not unkindly. "I never went to bed. There's tea, if you want it." "Thank you, Annie." The tea was weak and lukewarm, and the cup was chipped, and Miriam drank it standing by the scullery door, looking out across the small wet yard where the laundry lines hung empty in the half-light. She had not eaten since noon the day before. She did not feel hunger as hunger. She felt it as a thinness behind her eyes, a sharpening of edges. She had learned that this thinness was useful. It kept her quick. She was on the back stair again, the empty cup left in the scullery, when the front bell rang. It rang once. A single deep clang of the bronze, the kind of pull only a footman of a great house knows how to give. Confident, brief, undeniable. Miriam stopped on the half-landing with one hand on the banister. The whole house listened. She heard Pemberton, no, not Pemberton. The Stricklands had no Pemberton. She meant only their man Hobbs, cross the marble of the hall with the slap of a slipper not yet properly shod. She heard the door open. She heard a low voice on the step, too low to make out, and Hobbs saying, "Of course, my lord. At once, my lord. I shall inform Sir Reginald, my lord." The door closed. The slipper slapped back across the marble, faster now, and up the great stair to the master's chamber, and presently there was the muffled bellowing of Sir Reginald, roused from a port-soaked sleep, and Lady Honoria's higher voice, sharp as a tin whistle, calling for the curling tongs and the rose water, and Cassandra, and the second-best caps. Miriam went on up the back stair very quietly. She did not need to be told who had called. It was not yet 8. The Earl of Alnwick had said he would call before noon, and he had called at the hour the milk carts came, and that fact alone told her something about the man she had not previously allowed herself to think upon. A man who calls at 8 in March, when the streets are still gray and the great houses are still in their wrappers, is a man who does not intend to be turned away. She reached the sewing room. She closed the door, locked it, and stood with her back against the wood. For the first time in many months, her breath came shallow. She told herself it was the tea. She told herself it was the hour. She told herself it was the long night and the cold and the bleeding thumb. She told herself it was anything but the truth, which was that she had read the court circular the day before and seen that Lord Marbury, who had not danced a single dance the whole of last season, had returned 3 weeks ago to his townhouse in St. James's Square, and that since that return he had called upon precisely 4 houses in London, and that the first of those 4 houses had been the Bloomsbury rooms of her uncle, Lord Augustus Bridges, who was the only living soul in England who still called her by her name. She had told herself, when she read it, that it meant nothing. She told herself so again now, with her back against the door. A bell in the house jangled, Lady Honoria's bell, 3 short pulls, then a 4th that went on and on. Miriam crossed the room, washed her face in the basin of cold water by the window, dried it, took off the apron, set the mittens aside, smoothed her hair under the linen cap, and went down. Lady Honoria stood in the doorway of Cassandra's chamber in a wrapper of mauve sarcenet, her hair half undone, her face without the small carmine she put on by 10. She looked, in this state, every one of her 46 years, and she did not enjoy being seen so. "You! There! Heat the tongs, the good tongs, not the second pair, and the rose water from the green bottle, not the blue. And tell Hobbs to send up chocolate at once, and not the pot from last night. Do you hear me? Fresh chocolate. And do not look at me, girl. Get on." "Yes, my lady." "Lord Marbury is in the morning room." "Yes, my lady." "He is taking nothing. He has refused chocolate. He has refused coffee. He has refused to sit. He is standing by the window. Standing, as though he means to leave again in 5 minutes." She pressed both hands to her temples. "He cannot leave. Cassandra is not yet curled. Do you hear me, Miriam? Cassandra is not yet curled." "Yes, my lady." "Then go." Miriam went. She heated the tongs upon the small spirit lamp in the dressing room. She fetched the rose water from the green bottle. She sent the order to Hobbs for fresh chocolate. She set out Cassandra's morning gown of pale yellow muslin, the one Lady Honoria had decreed for any visit that might be paid before 11. She did all of it in the quick, soundless way she had taught herself, and she did not once cross the landing toward the morning room, and she did not once allow her eye to drift toward the great stair down which a man's voice might, at any moment, rise. Cassandra was brought to the dressing-stool by her mother, pale and ill-tempered and still half in sleep. Miriam took up a lock of the crimped hair and began to set it about the heated iron. Cassandra hissed, "You burned me." "I have not yet touched you, Miss Strickland." "You shall, and you shall burn me. I can tell from the way you hold the thing. Mamma, she means to burn me. She means no such thing." Lady Honoria's voice from the corner was thin and stretched. "Hold still. For the love of heaven, hold still. He is downstairs." "Who is downstairs?" "Lord Marbury." Cassandra's face changed. It changed in a way Miriam had seen before in this house, the small flushing about the throat and a quickening of the small blue eyes, as if a player had at last been dealt the card she had been waiting for since the deal began. "Then why am I in muslin? I should be in the sprigged silk." "You shall be in muslin, and you shall be grateful for it." "He has called before 9, Cassandra. He has called like a tradesman. We shall receive him as one receives a tradesman, with calm and dignity, and we shall not appear to have dressed for him. Do you understand? I understand that I should be in the sprigged silk. Hold still." Miriam set the iron. She set another curl. Her hands did not shake, because she had trained them many years ago not to shake. But she heard, as she worked, a single, quiet sound from the hall below, and she knew the sound. It was the sound of a man crossing marble in boots, the slow, regular tread of a tall man not in any hurry, the boots well made, the heels striking soft. The tread moved from the morning room to the foot of the great stair, and there it stopped. Lady Honoria heard it too. She rose from her chair. "He is at the stair. He cannot come up, Mamma. He cannot come up. He shall do what he wishes. He is the Earl of Alnwick." She was already moving to the landing, fastening the wrapper at her throat with one hand, smoothing her hair with the other. "Stay here, both of you. Miriam, finish her. Cassandra, do not move. Do not move." She went out. The door swung half-closed and stayed half-closed, as every door in this house stayed half-closed, and through the gap Miriam heard Lady Honoria's voice change in the space of 3 steps, from the shrill of the chamber to the honeyed murmur of the public landing. "My lord, you honor us. You honor us indeed. My daughter shall be down in a moment, only a moment. May I beg you return to the morning room, where a fresh pot—" "I think not, madam." The voice came up the well of the great stair, as if it had been waiting there for years to be heard. It was low, level, without warmth and without unkindness, and it carried the way a pistol shot carries across a winter field. Miriam's hand, holding the heated iron, stopped above Cassandra's hair. "I beg your pardon, my lord? I think not. I shall not return to the morning room. I shall not take chocolate. I shall not take coffee. I came upon a small matter of business, madam, and I shall conclude it from where I stand." A pause. Lady Honoria's voice, when it came, had lost a little of its honey. "Business, my lord? You have in your household," said the Earl of Alnwick, in the same even voice, "a young woman called Miriam." The iron in Miriam's hand grew very heavy. Cassandra's small blue eyes lifted to the looking-glass and found Miriam's there, and for one long second, the two reflections regarded each other without speaking. Then Cassandra's lips parted, and the color drained from her throat down into the muslin, and somewhere below, Lady Honoria began to laugh, the small, high laugh of a woman who has been struck and does not yet know it. Miriam set the iron down upon the spirit lamp. She did not put her hand to her breastbone, where the silver seal lay against her skin. She did not need to. She could feel it already, cool and certain, the way a key feels in a lock the moment before it turns. 3 days after the rainy night, the carriage of the Stricklands rattled down Bond Street and stopped before the discreet bow window of Maison Dufresne. Miriam climbed down last, after Cassandra, after Lady Honoria, after the bandboxes. She carried 2 of those bandboxes herself. The footman did not offer his hand. The bell above the modiste's door gave a single silver note. Inside, the air was warm with beeswax and lavender water and the faint, dry scent of new silk. Bolts of fabric stood ranked along the walls like soldiers of a quieter army. Pale rose, powder blue, ivory. A single bolt of deep emerald, set high above the rest, caught the morning light and held it. Miriam did not look at it. She had been trained, this past year, not to look at things she wanted. Madame Dufresne came from behind the curtain at the back of the shop. She was 41 and slender, with a streak of gray in her dark hair that ran like a single feather above her left temple. The blue measuring tape lay across her shoulders the way a priest wears a stole. She curtsied to Lady Honoria with the precise depth a French modiste owes an English baronet's wife, and not 1 inch more. "Madame Strickland, Mademoiselle, you are very welcome." Lady Honoria did not return the curtsy. She extended one black-gloved hand toward Cassandra and said, "The Devonshire Masquerade, Wednesday week. My daughter must be the first thing Lord Marbury sees when he enters that ballroom." Madame Dufresne inclined her head. "I have prepared 3 designs for Mademoiselle's consideration. Show them." The modiste clapped her hands once, softly, and 2 pale assistants appeared bearing the muslin patterns over their arms like sleeping children. Cassandra moved at once to the long pier glass. She did not look at the designs. She looked at her own reflection and arranged her face into the small, pleased expression she had practiced in her bedroom mirror since she was 14. "The pink," she said. "Always the pink." Mademoiselle wore pink at the Almack's opening, and at Lady Sefton's musical evening, and at the Carlton House drawing-room. "Then, I shall wear it again. Pink suits me. It does not suit her." Cassandra did not turn. She spoke to the mirror, and the mirror, by accident, included Miriam, who was setting down the bandboxes beside a velvet stool. "Pink suits no one with hair that color. Pink and red are a vulgarity. Lady Honoria's mouth thinned. Cassandra. It is the truth, Mama. Anyone may see it. Miriam set the second bandbox down without sound. She did not raise her eyes. She had learned long ago that to be looked at, in this house, was to be wounded. One survived by becoming furniture, and furniture does not flinch. Madame Dufresne, however, looked. For perhaps 2 seconds her dark eyes rested on Miriam, on the Spanish brown wool, the white linen cap, the careful stillness of the hands. Then she turned back to Cassandra with the same blandness she had worn before. The pink then, with petals of peach silk at the bodice, as Mademoiselle wished. The mask in white silk, plumed in rose. It shall be ready Tuesday. Wednesday morning, I shall not wear it before the night. As Mademoiselle commands. Lady Honoria opened her reticule. Half now, half on delivery, and I require Miss Verney to remain here through the morning. There are alterations to my own pelisse, which the girl can fetch home this afternoon. It saves a second journey. Of course, my lady. Cassandra turned at last from the mirror. Do not let her sit, madame. She has work enough at home and is grown lazy. As Mademoiselle wishes. The bell sang again. The Strickland carriage rattled away into the noise of Bond Street, and the shop, which had held its breath, exhaled. Madame Dufresne did not move at once. She stood looking at the closed door for a long moment, and her hand, which had been steady through the entire fitting, lifted to the camafeu brooch at her throat and pressed it lightly, as though confirming that something was still in its place. Then she turned. Mademoiselle Verney, come with me if you please. Miriam looked up. It was the first time she had been addressed by that name aloud in nearly a year, and she felt the sound of it strike somewhere beneath the ribs, in the small cold place where the signet ring hung on its black ribbon. Mademoiselle? Verney, the modiste repeated, more gently. It is your name, is it not? Come. The 2 assistants had vanished behind the curtain, at a small motion of their mistress's hand. The shop was empty. Outside, a coal cart passed. Inside, the morning light fell across the bolts of silk in long, pale bars. Miriam followed her through the curtain. The back room was smaller than she had expected and warmer. A coal grate burned low. A long deal table held shears, pins, a half-finished bodice of cream sarcenet. A second door at the rear was bolted with 3 bolts, an extravagance for a modiste storeroom. Madame Dufresne walked past the table and past the second door, and stopped beside a narrow staircase that climbed in shadow to an upper floor. There is a room above. It was once where my apprentices slept. It is empty now. I wish you to see it. Madam, I cannot. Lady Honoria expects you to be here. You will be here. Come. The stairs creaked. At the top, a single door stood ajar onto a narrow chamber under the eaves. 1 window, a truckle bed stripped to its ropes, a washstand, a square of carpet so worn its pattern had become a suggestion. Madame Dufresne closed the door behind them and slid a small bolt. Sit, child. There. On the bed. You have been on your feet since 5 o'clock. Do not pretend otherwise. I have watched the Strickland carriage at my door for 10 months. I know what hour they rise, and at whose hand. Miriam did not sit. She stood beside the washstand with her hands folded at her waist, exactly as she had been trained to stand in her father's drawing room when guests of state were announced. And the modiste, watching her, drew in a small breath through the nose. Yes, Madame Dufresne said, almost to herself. Yes, it is exactly as he said. As who said? The modiste did not answer at once. She crossed to the window, lifted the latch, and pushed the casement open a finger's breadth. A line of cold April air slid in over the sill. She closed it again. Mademoiselle, I am about to do a thing for which, if it is misunderstood, I may be turned out of England. I ask you to listen and not to speak until I have finished. Will you do this? Something in the woman's voice. Not pity, which Miriam had learned to refuse. Not curiosity, which she had learned to fear. Something older, the voice of a woman whose own hands had once been raw and who had not forgotten. Miriam nodded. Madame Dufresne reached into the pocket of her gray wool gown and brought out a small letter. The paper was thick and cream. The seal was a coin of black wax, and pressed into the wax was a single capital letter, ornate, slightly canted to the right. Miss. She held it out between 2 fingers. This was placed in my hand 4 days ago by a gentleman whose name I cannot tell you. He paid me 6 guineas to ensure that you, and only you, should open it, alone, before Wednesday. He paid me a further 4 guineas to ensure that no one in the Strickland house should ever know it had come to me. The seal has not been broken. I have not read what is within, do you understand? Miriam did not take the letter at once. She looked at the black wax. She looked at the canted M. You may refuse it, the modiste said. If you refuse it, I shall burn it in that grate before you leave this room, and neither of us will speak of this morning again. If you accept it, the burden is yours. Choose. The coal in the grate downstairs settled with a small, dry sound. Somewhere in Bond Street a horse stamped. Miriam thought of her father, of the last evening at Verney Park, of the way he had pressed the signet ring into her palm and folded her fingers around it and said only, "A Verney does not flinch." She thought of the rain on Grosvenor Square 3 nights ago, and of the carriage with the silver lozenge that had passed within 10 feet of her boot. She thought of the cool, certain feeling that had come over her on the kitchen flagstones, like a key turning in a lock. She took the letter. The wax broke under her thumb with a small dry crack. She unfolded the single sheet. The hand was a man's hand, upright, disciplined, written with a fine-pointed quill in ink the color of dried blood. 4 lines. To Miss M.V. On Wednesday, the 2nd of April, at the masquerade of His Grace of Devonshire, you will be expected. Madame D. will conduct you to the room she has prepared. Wear what she gives you. Conceal nothing. The hour of restoration has come. A friend who has waited 4 years. Beneath the 4 lines, no signature. Only, in the lower right corner, drawn very small and very precise in the same dried blood ink, a single oak leaf. Miriam read it twice. The second reading was slower than the first. When she had finished, she folded the paper carefully along its original folds, as though that mattered, and stood looking at it in her palm. An oak leaf, she said. Yes, you know what it signifies. I am a Frenchwoman, mademoiselle. I know nothing of English heraldry. You know. Madame Dufresne did not answer. She crossed to the truckle bed and knelt and ran her hand along the rope underneath the frame. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her gray wool, and walked to the square of worn carpet beside the washstand. She knelt again, took the corner of the carpet between her fingers, and folded it back. The board beneath had been cut. It was a small square, perhaps 2 feet by 2, and the cut had been hidden by the join of the planking. Madame Dufresne slid the blade of a small bodkin from the bib of her apron, fitted it into the seam, and lifted the panel. Beneath the floor lay a box. It was not large. Walnut, brass-bound, the wood dark with age and care. A single brass keyhole at the front. Across the lid, in slightly raised letters of inlaid silver wire, so fine that one had to bend close to see them, ran a motto, in Latin. Non flectitur, it does not bend. Miriam knew the words. She had embroidered them, at 7 years old, into a sampler that hung in her father's study at Verney Park. She had watched her mother's coffin lowered into a vault on whose pediment those same words were cut. She did not kneel. She stood very still, the letter still folded in her palm, and looked down into the cavity in the floor. Open it, Madame Dufresne said. I have no key. It is unlocked. He sent it so. Miriam knelt then, slowly, because her legs would not have carried her another moment. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined in pale silk the color of new cream. Folded within, with the patience of something laid down by hands that had taken hours over each crease, lay a gown. The silk was deep, deep emerald, the color of a forest pool in deep summer, almost black where the folds caught the shadow, almost living where the light touched it. The bodice was edged in cream Brussels lace so fine it looked like frost. A sash of gold satin lay coiled beside it, and on top of the folded silk, in a flat case of black velvet whose lid had been laid back, rested a parure, a collar of diamonds and emeralds, the emeralds set en cabochon, each the size of a thrush's eye, pendant earrings to match, a low tiara wrought as a chain of oak leaves, each leaf veined in fine gold wire, each acorn a single diamond. Miriam did not touch them. She knew what they were. Every titled woman of her grandmother's generation had known what they were. The Marbury parure had not been seen in public since 1809, when the 3rd Countess of Alnwick had worn it to be presented to the Queen, and had been spoken of, in drawing-rooms across 3 counties, as the finest such set in private hands in England. The hour of restoration has come. Madame, Miriam said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Whoever sent this is mistaken. I am a maid in the Strickland house. I cannot wear these stones into a Devonshire ballroom on Wednesday. I should be hanged before midnight. You will not be hanged. You do not know what they will say. I know what he will say. And his word, in that room, will weigh more than every voice you fear. Mademoiselle, look at me. Miriam lifted her head. The modiste's brown eyes were very still. I have measured women in this shop for 10 years, duchesses, marchionesses, a princess of the blood once, by a side door. I know within an inch the shoulder of every woman of fashion in London. When the gentleman came to me 4 days ago and gave me the measurements upon which this gown was cut, I asked him on what authority he had taken them. He answered that they had not been taken, they had been remembered. From the way a girl had stood, once, in a window in Norfolk, when she did not know she was being looked at. Miriam did not move. He remembered the line of your shoulder, Madame Dufresne said, to within the 1/8 part of an inch. I have cut this bodice from that memory. Try it. If it does not fit, I shall burn it and the letter together, and you will go home this afternoon with the police and we shall never speak, but it will fit. A coal settled in the grate below. The clock at the head of Bond Street struck 11, 4 floors of brick away, faint as a heartbeat. Norfolk, Miriam said. He named the place. He did not name himself. He said you would know. Norfolk. The Winter Garden at Bridges Court. 9 months ago, the August she had been sent to her great-uncle for a week, because Lady Honoria could not endure the sight of her in town during a heat wave. She had walked among the orange trees in their tubs because the gardener had said she might, and she had stood at the south window watching a robin on the gravel, and she had not known anyone was in the room behind her until she heard a man's voice say, very quietly, to her great-uncle, "She has her father's hands." She had turned. She had seen, at the far end of the long gallery, a tall man in a black coat with his back half turned to her, speaking to Lord Bridges. She had not seen his face. She had curtsied without knowing to whom, and had left the room because her great-uncle had lifted one finger to dismiss her, and she had not thought of the moment again for 9 months, because there had been no room in her life to think of anything that was not a needle or a kettle or a stair. She had stood at that window perhaps 40 seconds. He had remembered the line of her shoulder. "Madame," she said, "who is he? You will know on Wednesday. I have sworn upon my mother's grave not to name him before that hour. Do not ask it of me again. Is he honorable?" The modiste considered this for a long moment. When she answered slowly, as though weighing each word against a small balance. "In 10 years I have measured many men's wives, mademoiselle, and I have learned to know, from the wife, the husband. I have never measured his wife, for he has none. But I have spoken with 2 women who served his mother before she died, and with one old colonel who served beside him in Spain. They do not agree upon many things. They agree that he does not lie. They agree that when he gives his word, he gives it as other men give a deed of land, once, in writing, and never to be revoked." She paused. "He has given his word 4 times concerning you. I do not know to whom he gave the 4th, but the first 3 were given to your great-uncle, Lord Bridges, in a house in Bloomsbury Square 9 months ago, by candle, at midnight, with a contract sealed before 3 witnesses." Miriam's hand closed slowly upon the folded letter. "My great-uncle has not written to me in 2 years. Your great-uncle wrote of you for 2 hours that night. The colonel was the 2nd witness. The 3rd was a Scottish solicitor whose name I shall not say. The contract is in a strong box in Lincoln's Inn. It bears your signature. It bears no signature of mine. I have signed nothing. It bears the signature of your guardian, in your name, by the right of pupilage. Lord Bridges signed for you, as he was entitled. The marriage is conditional upon your free word, given of your own mouth, at the hour appointed. No church will marry you against your will. But the contract exists, the settlement is made, and the gentleman has been your betrothed in the eyes of 3 living men, and the law of this realm, for 9½ months." The room turned, very slightly. Miriam set her free hand upon the edge of the open box to steady herself. "Without my knowledge, without your knowledge, because the gentleman judged that if you were told, the Stricklands would know within a week, and you would not live to see Wednesday." Miriam looked down at the emerald silk and the oak leaf tiara and the cream lace edged like frost, and she understood, with the cold quiet of a sum done correctly, that the past 9 months of scrubbed pots and split fingers and Cassandra's small daily cruelties had been the months of her betrothal, conducted, on the other side of a wall she had not known was there, by a man whose face she had never seen. "He has been waiting 9 months. He has been waiting 4 years, mademoiselle. The 9 months are only the latest of them." Miriam knelt for a long time looking at the gown. Then, very carefully, she closed the velvet case over the perigere, and lowered the lid of the walnut box, and slid the cut panel back into place, and folded the worn carpet over the seam. She stood. She tucked the broken sealed letter inside the bib of her apron, behind the signet ring on its black ribbon, so that the two pressed together against her skin like a key, and the lock it was cut to fit. "Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday. At what hour? The masquerade opens at 10. You will be in this room by 9:30. I shall send my own chair for you from the corner of Grosvenor Mews at 9. You will tell the Strickland household, this evening, that I require you here at first light Wednesday morning to assist in the final fitting of Miss Strickland's pink, and that the fitting must continue into the night, because Miss Strickland has not yet approved the petals. You will tell this in such a way that Lady Honoria, who hates the Modistes bill more than she hates you, agrees out of meanness. Can you tell such a lie, mademoiselle?" A small movement at the corner of Miriam's mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the first thing very near to a smile her face had attempted in many months, and it surprised her by how well her face remembered the shape. "I have been told lies for a year, madame. I find I have learned the grammar of them." "Good, then go down. There is a pelisse for Lady Honoria upon the deal table. It is genuinely altered. You will carry it home with the bandboxes. You will be exactly the maid you were this morning. You will not look once at the bolt of emerald above the door as you pass. Do you understand?" "Yes, mademoiselle." Miriam turned at the door. Madame Dufresne stood very upright beside the washstand, the streak of gray in her hair caught by the window light. "I left France in '93, with my mother's wedding ring sewn into the hem of a child's coat. I have not knelt to any sovereign of any nation since. I knelt this morning to the Stricklands because they pay my rent. I tell you this so that you may understand what I do next." She inclined her body, slowly, in a curtsy so deep that her gray skirt brushed the worn carpet. She held the curtsy for the count of 3. Then she rose. "Until Wednesday, Lady Alnwick." Miriam did not correct her. She went down the stairs with her steps very even, and her hand resting lightly upon the banister. In the front of the shop she lifted Lady Honoria's pelisse, neatly folded in tissue, and set it across her arm above the 2 bandboxes. The 2 pale assistants had reappeared at their tables and did not look up. The bell sang once over the door as she went out. Bond Street was full of late morning. A pieman cried at the corner. A barouche passed with a yellow umbrella raised against the watery sun. A crossing sweeper held out his hand for a halfpenny, and Miriam, who had no halfpenny, inclined her head to him with the grave courtesy a Verney owed any creature of God's making, and the boy, who had been shouted at since dawn by women in better gowns, blinked once and snatched his cap from his head and stood bareheaded as she passed, without understanding why. She walked the half-mile back to Grosvenor Square at the pace of a maid carrying bandboxes. Her face was the face of a maid carrying bandboxes. Beneath the bib of her apron, the broken seal and the silver signet pressed together against her ribs with each step, and beneath her boots the paving stones of Bond Street rang faintly, as though a great hollow chamber had opened beneath the city in the past half hour, and her steps now passed across its vaulted roof. At the area door of the Strickland house she paused, set down the bandboxes, smoothed her apron, and lifted the latch. Cassandra was on the first landing in her morning gown, leaning over the banister with the small, avid expression she wore, when she suspected someone of having enjoyed a moment unobserved. "You are late. Madame required an extra fitting of your ladyship's pelisse, miss." There was a tear in the lining she had not noticed. "You are flushed." "I walked quickly, miss, that I might not be late. You smell of Madame's coal." "Yes, miss." Cassandra studied her a moment longer, and Miriam stood beneath the study with her eyes lowered and her hands folded and her face perfectly empty, and the small avid look on Cassandra's face slowly cooled into boredom, because there was nothing to feed upon, because the maid before her was exactly the maid who had carried out the slops that morning, and a girl who has not changed is not interesting. "Take the pelisse to my mother, then come to my room. I have torn the 3rd petal of the pink, and you will sew it before luncheon." "Yes, miss." Cassandra turned upon the landing and went back into the morning room with the door pulled shut behind her. Miriam carried the pelisse up the back stair to Lady Honoria's dressing room. She laid it across the chaise. She curtsied to the empty room out of habit. She went down again to the kitchen passage and along it to the small whitewashed cupboard under the stair, where her own palette lay rolled against the wall, and she stopped there a moment in the half-dark, alone for the first time since the bell had rung above Madame Dufresne's door. She drew the letter from beneath the bib of her apron. She held it a moment in her palm without unfolding it. Then she lifted the black ribbon from around her neck and slid the signet ring from it and laid the ring upon the letter, and looked at the two of them together upon the linen of her apron, in the gloom of the cupboard under the stair, in the house of the people who had taken her name from her. The silver crest of the Vernies faced upward, the broken wax of the canted M faced upward, and between them, where the firelight from the kitchen door fell faintly through the gap, the two small objects met edge to edge upon the rough linen, and for the space of one breath they looked, to her own eyes, like the two halves of a single coin that had been cut in two, long ago by a careful hand, and entrusted to two different keepers, against the day they should be brought together again. She did not weep. She had been told, at 7 years old, embroidering a sampler in her father's study, that a Verney does not weep at the recognition of her own arms. She slid the ring back upon the ribbon. She tied the ribbon at her nape. She refolded the letter and tucked it deep beneath the pallet, between the ticking and the canvas, in the place where the housekeeper would not search, because the housekeeper would not stoop. Then she stood and smoothed her apron and went up to Miss Strickland's room to mend the third petal of the pink, and as her needle entered the silk for the first stitch she heard, in some quiet chamber behind her ribs, the small dry sound of a bolt being drawn back. To understand the sound of that bolt, one must travel back 9 months, to a country whose hedgerows still wore the russet of late June, and to a glass house in Norfolk where the air smelled of bruised geranium and warm slate. The Earl of Alnwick had not wished to attend the Dowager Lady Pevensy's garden breakfast. He had accepted the invitation because his secretary, a thin young man named Halford, had pointed out that to refuse a 4th time would be a kind of insult, and the Earl, for all that the world called him the Ice Lord, was not in the business of insulting widows. So he had ridden the 11 miles from Alnwick Hall in a black coat that was too warm for the season, and he had stood beneath the glass roof of the orangery with a cup of indifferent chocolate in his gloved hand, and he had endured. There were 3 viscountesses, 2 bishops, a Whig who would not stop talking about turnips, and a cluster of debutantes arranged by their mothers as carefully as the pineapples upon the side table. The Earl looked at none of them. He looked at the brickwork, which was old, and at the orange trees, which were tired. Then the Strickland party arrived. He knew the Stricklands by reputation only. Sir Reginald had once tried to corner him at White's about a horse, and he had walked away mid-sentence. Lady Honoria was a woman whose voice carried even when she was attempting to whisper. Cassandra he had never bothered to look at. She was, he understood, 17 at the time, and 17-year-old girls bored him in a manner that was almost a moral condition. But behind the 3 Stricklands, half a pace behind Lady Honoria's pruna-colored shoulder, walked a girl in gray. She was carrying Cassandra's shawl folded over her left arm, and a small basket of stitching, and a fan she was not permitted to use. She wore a gray wool gown that had been a gray wool gown for several seasons. Her hair was tucked beneath a white linen cap. She did not raise her eyes from the gravel. The Earl, who had been about to set his cup down, did not set it down. He watched the party progress along the path. He watched Lady Honoria pause to greet the Dowager. He watched Cassandra simper at a captain of the 10th. He watched Sir Reginald pat his own waistcoat, as if to confirm that it was still there. And he watched the girl in gray shift the shawl from her left arm to her right, with a small, precise turn of the wrist. It was the wrist that did it. The Earl had been a boy of 19, sitting in the gallery of the House of Lords, the afternoon the 4th Viscount Verney had risen to answer the charges laid against him. He had not been there for Verney. He had been there because his father had told him to come and watch how a man behaves when the men around him have decided to destroy him. Verney had risen. He had set his right hand upon the rail before him, and then, before he spoke, he had performed a small, precise turn of the wrist, as if shaking a drop of ink from a pen he was not holding. The gesture had meant nothing to anyone in that chamber. The Earl had remembered it for 9 years because it had been the only sign, in an otherwise unmoving body, that the man was afraid and would not let himself be ruled by it. The girl in gray, 60 feet away across the gravel of a Norfolk orangery, had done it exactly. He set the cup of chocolate down upon the side table with great care, as a man sets down a thing that has suddenly become breakable. He did not approach her. He was not a fool. He went instead to the Dowager Pevensey and asked, in the indifferent voice he used for asking after the weather, who the young person in gray behind the Stricklands might be. The Dowager, who liked him, gave a small dry smile that contained a great deal of London, and said the girl was a poor relation, taken in for charity, name of something biblical, Miriam or Martha, she could never recall, and that Lady Honoria worked her like a Tuesday laundress, and let it be known publicly that she did so out of kindness. "Verney," the Earl said, in the same indifferent voice. The dowager's smile sharpened by half a degree. "I should not say, but I should not say no either," he thanked her. He did not finish his chocolate. He rode the 11 miles back to Alnwick Hall in a silence that even his groom remarked upon afterwards. In the harness room, in the hearing of two boys who would tell the story for the rest of their lives without knowing what the story was. That night, in the library at Alnwick, beneath a portrait of a grandfather who had bought half of Northumberland with prize money from a single French frigate, the Earl wrote 3 letters by his own hand. The first was to a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, whose discretion he had bought in 1813 and had never overspent. The second was to an old captain of his who lived in Bedford Square and still owed him a great deal that no ledger recorded. The third was to a name he had not written for 9 years, the name of an elderly gentleman in Bloomsbury Square, who had once been the dearest friend of the 4th Viscount Verney, a man called Lord Augustus Bridges. Pemberton brought the post out at dawn. The Earl had not slept. He stood by the cold grate in his shirt sleeves, the tremor in his right hand more pronounced than usual, his left hand pressed flat against the marble of the chimney-piece to keep it still. "My lord," Pemberton said, without inflection, "shall I have a fire laid?" "No," the Earl said. "I am quite warm." It was a precise, elegant lie, of the kind the household had grown accustomed to. Pemberton bowed and withdrew. Within a fortnight the Earl was in London. He took rooms at his own house in Berkeley Square, which had been shut up for 3 years, and he opened only the library and the small dining room, and he received no callers. The solicitor in Lincoln's Inn came to him at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carrying a leather case worn smooth at the corners, and laid upon the table the contents of 9 years of patient, quiet, expensive enquiry into the matter of the Verney calumny of 1815. There were 3 principal architects of it. The first was a man now in India who could be reached by letter and ruined within the year. The second was a man now dead, which was a small mercy and a small inconvenience in equal measure, since the dead cannot be made to apologize. The third was a man now sitting, every Friday, at the green baize tables at White's, drinking the Earl's own port without knowing whose port it had been, and that man was Sir Reginald Strickland. The Earl read the dossier through twice. He did not change expression. When he had finished, he closed it and laid his palm upon it and said, "I shall require a private interview with the Lord Chancellor." The solicitor inclined his head. "When, my lord?" "When it can be obtained without remark." "That may be some weeks." "I have some weeks." The solicitor withdrew. The Earl rose and walked to the window. Berkeley Square in October was a quiet, brown place, and a thin rain was beginning. He thought of a girl in a gray wool gown carrying a shawl that was not hers, and of a wrist turning in the air, and of a House of Lords 9 years gone, and he understood, with the clarity that came to him in small and important matters, that he was no longer in command of his own movements. He had become an instrument of something else, and the something else had a name, and the name was justice, and he was glad of it. That same week, in a narrow house in Bloomsbury Square, whose drawing room smelled of beeswax and old book paper, Lord Augustus Bridges set down his cup of tea and said, "I do not understand why you are here." The Earl had taken the chair opposite. He had refused tea. His gloves lay upon his knee. "I am here," he said, "because the daughter of your oldest friend is at this moment hemming a pink gown in the house of the man who broke her father." The old man's hand, which had been steady on the cup, began to tremble. He set the cup down, he took it up again, he set it down again. The clock on the mantel struck the half-hour. Outside, in the square, a dog barked once and was quiet. "You know where she is," Lord Augustus said at last. "I know where she is. And you have come to me." "I have come to you because I will not move without your blessing, and because I will require your name upon a document, and because she has no other living relation who will own her." Lord Augustus looked at his hands. They were old and freckled, and the right one was tremulous. "I tried," he said, very quietly. "In 15, I tried, and I was told that to associate with the name was to be the next name. I was a coward, my lord. I was 62 years of age, and I was a coward." "You were 62 years of age, and you were alive," the Earl said. "I require you to be alive now. I require something more difficult of you presently." The old man raised his eyes. They were watery and pale blue, and they were, for the first time in 9 years, not afraid. "Tell me," he said. The Earl told him. He told him in flat sentences, in the order in which the matters would have to be accomplished, and he made no rhetoric of any of it. He would obtain from the Lord Chancellor a decree restoring the honor of the 4th Viscount Verney, and naming, by name, the 3 architects of the calumny of 1815. He would obtain from the College of Arms an attestation of the legitimate descent of Miss Miriam Verney. He would, at a date and in a setting yet to be determined, present these documents in such a manner as to ruin Sir Reginald Strickland socially, legally, and financially in one evening, and not before. And he would, on the morning following that evening, make Miss Miriam Verney the Countess of Alnwick, if she would have him, and he would, whether she would have him or not, settle upon her in perpetuity the sum required to maintain her household and her name in independence, with the documents drawn, so that no husband, including himself, might touch a farthing of it. Lord Augustus listened. When the Earl had finished, the old man said, "And what do you require of me?" "3 things. Name them. That you receive me, as her nearest living relation, as the man asking your permission. That you sign, with me, the betrothal contract under conditions of the strictest secrecy, in this room, with 2 witnesses of your choosing. And that, until the night appointed, you say nothing to her, write nothing to her, and do nothing to alter the course of her present captivity. She must not be warned. If she is warned, she will be moved, and if she is moved, I shall lose her, and I shall not lose her." The old man was silent for a long time. "You ask me to leave that child in that house for another half-year. I ask you to leave her there for as long as it takes to make her safe forever." Lord Augustus looked at his hands again. Then he looked at the Earl, and he looked at him for a long moment, and what he saw in the Earl's gray eyes was not what the world saw. The world saw ice, the old man, who had buried a friend and lost a goddaughter, and lived 9 years in the brown silence of his own cowardice, saw a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for a wrist to turn in a Norfolk orangery. "I shall require 1 promise of you," he said. "Name it." "3 promises. I am an old man, and I am entitled to my own." The Earl inclined his head. "3 then. You will clear the name of Henry Verney, not merely restore it. Clear it, in the public record, by the public hand, so that no child of his blood shall ever again hear the word Verney spoken with a curl of the lip. I will. You will marry her, not after she is restored, before. The contract first. If anything befalls you between this room and the night appointed, she shall be the Dowager Countess of Alnwick, and she shall have your name and your jointure, and let the world make of it what it will. I will. And you will never, in any matter however small, ask her to lie. Not in society, not to your steward, not to your own face in a difficult hour. She has lived 9 years in a house of lies. She will not live another in mine." The Earl was silent. The silence was not hesitation. It was the silence of a man weighing the promise against the whole length of his future, and finding that the future bore the weight. "I will not," he said. "Then I am yours," Lord Augustus said. "And she is yours, so far as I may give what is not mine. May God help you, my lord. She is her father's daughter. You will find she does not bend." "I am not in want of bending," the Earl said. That night, in the small back parlor of the house in Bloomsbury Square, by the light of 3 wax candles upon a writing table that had once belonged to the 4th Viscount Verney himself, the betrothal contract was signed. The witnesses were the solicitor from Lincoln's Inn and the old captain from Bedford Square, both of whom had been bound to silence by older oaths than this one. The contract was in the Earl's own hand, and it was very short. It named the parties. It named the date by which the marriage should be solemnized, being not later than the 1st day of June 1818. It settled upon the bride, before marriage and irrevocably, the manor of Sturry in Kent, together with its 3 farms, the income arising therefrom to be hers absolutely whether she should marry the Earl or no other living person, and to descend to her female issue in default of male. It bore, beneath the Earl's bold black signature, the trembling spidery signature of Lord Augustus Bridges, and beneath that the 2 witness hands, and beneath that, at the foot of the page in the Earl's own writing, the 3 short Latin words by which a gentleman in those years bound his honor to a thing he would not afterwards revisit. Ita juro, ego. When the candles had been put out and the witnesses had gone, the Earl stood in the dark parlor, with his right hand against the mantel to steady it, and he said aloud, "To no one. She does not know any of it. She is in that house tonight, and she does not know. It was the first time in his adult life he had spoken aloud to an empty room. He found he did not mind it. He returned to Berkeley Square. He resumed the manner the town knew. He attended White's twice a week and lost moderately at whist. He was seen, in November, in his own box at the Italian Opera, alone, paying no attention to the stage. He was seen, in December, riding in the park at the unfashionable hour of 9 in the morning, his greatcoat collar turned up against the fog. He spoke to no one of any matter that pertained to a girl in gray. When Lady Jersey, who missed nothing, asked him pointedly across a dinner table whether it were true that Alnwick was at last to be reopened to the world, he said, "It may be, in the spring. I have not decided," and changed the subject so neatly that even she could not follow it. But in the locked drawer of the writing table in the library of Berkeley Square, there lay, beneath 3 layers of letters of no importance, a sealed packet wrapped in oilskin. It contained a copy of the betrothal contract. It contained the dossier of the Strickland affair. It contained the draft of a decree, awaiting only the seal of the Lord Chancellor. It contained, in a small velvet bag, an emerald and diamond ring that had been the Earl's grandmother's, and a piece of black ribbon long enough to thread it upon, against the day when the bearer might be presented with the choice of wearing it openly or hiding it next to a signet ring she had carried, in secret, for 9 years. The decree was harder than the contract. The Earl waited 3 weeks for the private audience with Lord Chancellor Hargrave, and when it came he was made to wait a further hour in an anteroom whose fire had not been laid. He did not protest, he stood. When at last he was admitted, he laid the dossier upon the great desk, and he spoke for 11 minutes without pause. And when he had finished, he said, "My lord, I do not ask for vengeance. I ask for a correction of the public record. The correction is owed." Hargrave was a fat man with a powdered wig and small, severe eyes, and he was not a man who could be moved by emotion. He read the dossier. He read it slowly. He read certain pages a second time. When he had finished, he removed his spectacles and laid them upon the leather, and he said, "Alnwick, this is the work of a lifetime. It is the work of 9 years. And what is your interest in it?" The Earl did not lie. "I am affianced to the lady. The contract is sealed." The Chancellor's small eyes did not change. "I see. I do not press the personal matter, my lord. I press only the public one. The decree may be drawn without any mention of the betrothal. The betrothal may be announced, if I am permitted my own ordering of these affairs, by my own hand, at a time of my own choosing, in a setting that will leave no doubt of the lady's standing." The Chancellor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You have always been a singularly cold man, Alnwick. I am pleased to learn you are also a singularly thorough one. I shall take that, my lord, as the warmest compliment your office has ever paid me." The faintest of dry smiles touched the Chancellor's mouth. He drew toward him a sheet of vellum. He took up a pen. "The decree shall be drawn," he said. "It shall name the 3. It shall be sealed by the 2nd week of April. The Crown does not concern itself with the hour at which a gentleman chooses to acquaint a young lady with her own restoration. I assume you have an hour in view." "I have a ball in view, my lord." "Devonshire's?" "Devonshire's." "It is a public enough stage." Hargrave dipped his pen. "Have it, then. And Alnwick, my lord, when you present the decree, you will present it to the Master of Ceremonies in such a manner as to be heard by all. The Crown's correction is no use whispered. Are we understood?" "We are understood, my lord." He left the chamber. In the corridor outside, in a wedge of pale February sunlight falling through a high window, he closed his eyes for the space of one breath, and then he opened them and resumed his customary expression, and he walked out into Whitehall, and his carriage was brought, and he went home. That winter he did not see her once. He could have contrived it. He could have engineered an encounter at a draper's, at a circulating library, in the cold, dim aisle of a fashionable church. He did not. The promise to Lord Augustus held him. The promise to himself held him harder. She was not to be warned, and she was not to be courted by stealth, and she was not to learn of him a single thing before the hour at which she would learn all of him at once. The discipline of it cost him more than he had expected. There were nights when he sat in the dark library at Berkeley Square with a glass of brandy he did not drink, and considered, in the way a man considers a wound, the fact that somewhere within a mile of him, a young woman with a small precise turn of the wrist was going up a back stair with a candle in her hand, alone. In late February he sent for Madame Genevieve Dufresne. She came on foot, in a gray woolen pelisse, with a measuring tape of blue silk folded inside her reticule. She was shown to the library. She sat in the chair. The solicitor and the captain and Lord Augustus had each sat in, and she folded her hands, and she waited. "Madame," the earl said, "I am told that the Stricklands employ you." "They do, my lord, and that a young person in their household occasionally accompanies the daughter to your premises." Madame Dufresne's mouth did not move, her eyes did. "She does, my lord." "You will, I hope, forgive me a question that is not customary. What is your opinion of the young person?" The modiste considered. She had been 10 years out of France, and she had buried 2 husbands, and she had measured the waists of half the duchesses in England, and she was not easily startled. "My opinion, my lord, is that she is the only person who enters my establishment in the company of Mrs. Strickland, whom I would consent to dress, were the matter of payment ever to be raised in a manner that did not involve Mrs. Strickland. It will be raised so." She looked at him. The look was long. "My lord, I shall require for the 2nd Wednesday of April a gown of the deepest emerald silk, cut for a young woman of 21, slender, of a height somewhat above the ordinary, with hair the color of new copper, cut to be worn without a mask. The fitting cannot be done upon the wearer in advance. You will work from a single measurement which I shall obtain to you, and from your own eye, which I am told is the best in London. My lord flatters. My lord does not flatter. I shall require also a small chamber, on the night of the ball itself, in a house adjoining Devonshire's, in which the lady may be dressed at the 11th hour, by yourself and by 2 women of your choosing who do not speak. Is it possible?" "It is possible. It will be expensive. It will be very expensive, my lord. You will be paid in full upon delivery. You will be paid again, in equal amount, upon your silence between this hour and that one. If you fail of the silence, I shall know it, and you will not be paid the 2nd time, and you will not work in this city again. Are we understood, madame?" Madame Dufresne rose. She made him a small, deep curtsy of a kind he had not seen since before the war, the curtsy of a woman who had been presented at Versailles when she was 19. "We are understood, my lord. The young person will be the most beautiful woman in the room. I shall make it so. I do not require beauty, madame. I require that she enter the room as herself." The Frenchwoman's mouth moved at last. It was not quite a smile. "My lord," she said, "those are the same thing. You will discover it presently." She left him. He stood at the window long after her grey pelisse had vanished into the February dusk of Berkeley Square. The tremor in his right hand was very pronounced. He pressed the hand against the cold pane until the glass took the warmth from it, and the tremor with it, and when he turned back to the room, he was, to any observer, the Ice Lord again. The weeks moved. March came in upon a flat wind out of the east. In Bond Street, in the back room of the Maison Dufresne, a wooden box was prepared, and the box was lined with 3 layers of silk paper, and into the box was laid an emerald gown the color of a Norfolk pond at evening, and a parure of diamonds and emeralds in a velvet case, and a pair of long pelisse skin gloves, and a fan of ivory, and a single sealed note bearing in black wax the initial M. The box was sewn shut in oilcloth. The oilcloth was sewn shut in burlap. Madame Dufresne carried it herself to the small back chamber of her own premises, and she lifted a loose board in the floor, and she laid the box beneath it, and she put the board back, and she set upon the board a basket of pins, and she said nothing to anyone. And in a house in Grosvenor Square, on a night in early March, a girl in a grey wool gown sat by a tallow candle and mended the hem of a pink ball gown, and felt against her ribs the cold weight of a silver signet ring she had carried for 9 years, and did not know that 2 streets away, a man was at that moment writing, in a hand that no one in the world but himself could read, the words, "It begins on the 2nd Wednesday of April. God grant her the courage I have already paid for in my own." 3 nights after Madame Dufresne placed the box beneath the loose board, a small folded paper was slipped into the pocket of Miriam Verney's apron in the back passage of the Maison Dufresne by a hand she did not see, and she felt it there as she climbed back into the Strickland carriage, and she did not draw it out until she was alone in her attic at 1 in the morning, with the door bolted and the candle guttering. The paper was sealed in black wax with the initial M. She broke the seal with her thumb. She read the 4 lines twice. She read them a 3rd time. Then she folded the paper very small, and she slid it inside the bodice of her grey gown against the signet ring, and she sat for a long time upon the edge of her narrow bed without moving. And at last she rose, and she crossed to the casement, and she pushed it open into the cold March night above the mews, and she stood there with her face into the wind until her eyes stopped burning, and she said, aloud, to the dark roofs of London, in a voice no louder than the turning of a page, "Father, I have been seen." And in the library of a house in Berkeley Square, at that same hour, a man stood at his own window with a glass of brandy he did not drink, and felt, in some quiet chamber behind his own ribs, the small dry sound of a bolt being drawn back, and knew, without being told, that the second Wednesday of April had already begun. The second Wednesday of April arrived in London the way all great hinges of a life arrive, quietly, with weather. A thin spring rain had washed the pavements of Piccadilly clean by noon, and by 4 o'clock a pale sun had broken through, gilding the wet slate roofs of Mayfair as though the city itself had been polished for the occasion. In Grosvenor Square, the Strickland house breathed in the steam of curling tongs and orange flower water. Maids ran with hot copper pans up the back stairs, and Lady Honoria's voice, sharpened by an entire day of fasting, cut through every door it passed. Miriam Verney moved through that house unseen. She carried Cassandra's hairpins on a black velvet cushion. She fetched the silver bowl of crushed ice for the swollen lids of a debutante who had wept since breakfast at the thought of her own beauty. She knelt twice on the cold marble of Cassandra's dressing room to pin the hem of the pale rose taffeta, and twice she rose without saying a word. The Spanish brown wool dress hung loose on her by now. She had eaten very little for 3 days. Beneath the corded stays, she could feel the cold, round weight of the Verney signet against her sternum, and the cold did not warm. At 5:30, a back door bell rang. A boy in a brown jacket pressed a folded paper into Mrs. Hodges' palm, and was gone before the housekeeper could ask his name. The paper was carried with the day's marketing accounts to the small parlor where Miriam was darning the torn ostrich plume of Cassandra's mask, and Mrs. Hodge laid it on the table without comment, only her eyes meeting Miriam's for a second longer than was needful. The note read, 8 o'clock, the Mews door behind Berkeley Street. A black carriage with no crest. The boy will say only the word Norfolk. There was no signature. There was only, in the corner, a small mark in red wax the size of a fingernail, a coronet of strawberry leaves. Miriam closed her hand over the paper and felt the heat of the small wax bead through her palm. She did not let her face change. She finished the plume. She carried the mended mask up to Cassandra and held it while Cassandra struck her own cheek twice with the back of a hairbrush, complaining that the rose was uneven. "There," Cassandra said at last, satisfied by her own redness. "Now I shall be the most desired creature in that ballroom, and Lord Marbury, if he is there, shall know it before the second set." "Yes, miss," Miriam said. "You will sit up for me until I return. I do not care if it is dawn." "Yes, miss. And do not let that fire go out in my dressing room. I shall be cold." "No, miss." Cassandra turned from the glass. For an instant, in the candlelight, she looked at Miriam with a sharp, narrow puzzlement, as though some small wrong note had sounded in a familiar tune, and she could not place it. Then she shrugged the puzzle off. She had a coach to enter. By 7:30, the Strickland carriage had rolled out of Grosvenor Square with Sir Reginald sweating into his nankeen breeches, and Lady Honoria's turban pluming above the window like a purple smokestack. Cassandra waved from the door in her pink seda and was gone. The house, after them, fell into the strange light hush that great houses always fall into when their owners depart. Below stairs a footman whistled. Above stairs a single tall clock ticked. Miriam climbed the back staircase to the attic room where she slept. She lit no candle. She knelt on the bare floor, pried up the loose board with the tip of her button-hook, and lifted out the sealed box. She did not open it. She tied it in her shawl, knotted the shawl across her chest under the wool dress like a peddler's bundle, drew her gray cloak over all, and went down through the kitchen door past Mrs. Hodge, who turned her back so that she might honestly say, later, that she had seen nothing. The mews behind Berkeley Street smelled of damp straw and lamp oil. The black carriage waited under a guttering oil lamp with its lamps shuttered. The horses were black. The coachman wore plain dark cloth. A boy of perhaps 12 stepped down from the box, and his eyes in the lamplight were extremely blue. "Norfolk," the boy said. "Norfolk," Miriam answered. He opened the door. The interior smelled of fresh cedar and beeswax. She climbed in. The door closed without sound. The carriage moved off through the wet narrow lanes at a quiet walk, as though it carried nothing of importance at all, and turned at last not east toward Devonshire House but west, into a quieter square, and drew up before a tall, thin house she did not know. A woman opened the door before the boy could knock. She wore the cinder-gray wool of a Bond Street workroom and an apron whiter than fresh snow. A length of blue silk measuring tape lay across her shoulders. Her hair had one streak of gray at the temple shaped like a V. "Mademoiselle," Madame Dufresne said, and inclined her head as one inclines a head to a marchioness. "We have 1 hour. Come." The room behind the door was small and warm, and very bright. 3 branches of wax candles stood on the mantel. A copper hip bath of steaming water waited in the center of the boards. 2 young women in plain gray gowns stood by the hearth with linen sheets folded over their arms. Neither of them spoke. Madame Dufresne would explain, later, that neither could. Their tongues had been with them at birth, but their loyalty was older than their tongues. "The box, please," Madame said. Miriam unknotted the shawl. Madame received the box with both hands, as a priest receives a chalice, and set it upon a side table without opening it. Then she turned, and her dark eyes considered the wool dress, the worn boots, the chapped knuckles, with a brisk professional sorrow. "Out of these things, mademoiselle," she said. "Every one, the wool, the stays, the shift. Tonight you will not wear so much as a thread of the Strickland house upon your skin." The mute women came forward with the sheets. Behind a folding screen of painted leather, Miriam stepped out of the Spanish brown wool, unlaced the corded stays, slipped the coarse linen shift over her head, and laid it folded on the chair. The signet, on its black ribbon, she did not take off. Madame, behind the screen, touched only the ribbon, not the ring. "That stays with you," Madame said softly. "Always. But tonight, not under the gown, tonight upon." Miriam stepped into the bath. The water was hot enough to sting, and scented with rosemary and white roses. One of the mute women washed her hair, twice, with a soap that smelled of orange flowers and almonds. The other knelt at the side of the bath and worked rose oil into the chapped skin of Miriam's hands until the small splits closed and the knuckles shone. When she stepped out, she was wrapped in linen and seated on a low stool before the mirror. Madame did her hair. The red abundance of it, freed of pins and cap, fell almost to the small of her back, the color of polished copper coin. Madame brushed it for a long, quiet time. Then she braided into the front a slender string of pearls, 3 rows deep, that ran from temple to temple like a coronet, and let the rest fall loose down her back in heavy waves. She set no cap on it. She set no turban. She set no plume. "Tonight," Madame said, "they will see your hair, mademoiselle. They have not seen it in 3 years." Then she opened the box. The silk that came out was not green. It was the green of deep wet moss after rain, of the river under Alnwick Bridge in shadow, of a leaf held against a candle. The gown unfolded across the white sheet on the bed in long, quiet folds, and the candlelight slid along the silk and made it almost black where it folded, and almost flame where it caught the light. The Brussels lace at the bosom was the color of fresh cream. The gold satin sash, when Madame lifted it, ran across her hands like a thread of liquid metal. Miriam looked at the dress, and her hand went, without her permission, to the ribbon at her throat. She held the small, cold weight of the Verney signet against her collarbone for a moment, and her breath was uneven. "Mademoiselle?" Madame said. "It is too much," Miriam said. Her voice was very low. "I have not been a Verney in a public room for 3 years. I do not know if I remember how." "You have been a Verney every hour of those 3 years," Madame said. "The body remembers what the world forgets. Lift your arms." She lifted her arms. The shift went on first, fine as a breath. Then the long stays, laced with a careful, steady pressure that lifted her ribs and straightened her back. Then a single petticoat of cream silk, then the gown itself, slipping over her shoulders in a long, cold rush, settling at the waist as though it had been measured in a room she had never been in, which of course it had. Madame, behind her, drew the laces, set the sash, smoothed the lace at the bosom with a thumb that was both swift and reverent. "Now," Madame said, "the Marbury pieces." She lifted the long necklace first. 12 emeralds the size of small hazelnuts hung from a chain of diamonds. When Madame laid it across Miriam's collarbone, the stones were already warm, as though the box had remembered the heat of bodies long dead. The 2 pear-shaped emerald drops went into the small holes of her ears that no one in Grosvenor Square had ever thought to ask about. The low tiara, 3 rows of diamonds with a single emerald at the front, settled into the heavy red hair as if it had always belonged there. The signet on the black ribbon, last, Madame did not move from beneath the gown. She lifted it gently and laid it instead over the lace at the throat, so that the small, worn silver crest of the Verneys lay above the great green and white stones of the Marburies, the older, smaller, plainer claim above the newer, richer one. "There," Madame said, very softly. "Now you are dressed." Miriam looked into the mirror. For one long moment she did not recognize the woman who looked back. Then she did, and her eyes filled, and Madame, with the back of a finger, lifted the threatened tear away before it could fall. "No," Madame said, "not tonight. Tonight you do not weep. Tonight you walk." The cream pelisse went over her shoulders. The long pelisse hood went up. The mute women drew the dressing-room curtains. The boy with the blue eyes was already at the door. The carriage took her not to Devonshire House but to a small mews door at the back of it, where a single torch burned. A gray-haired man in plain black livery stood waiting. He bowed without surprise. "Madame and her party have been expected," my lord said, the man murmured. "If you will follow me." She followed him through a small servant's passage that smelled of beeswax and roasting capon, up a narrow stair that turned 3 times, and out at last through a curtained door into a long anteroom behind the great staircase of the ballroom floor. From beyond the curtain came the breathing of the ball, the low collective swell of 200 mascaraed voices and the violins tuning a quadrille. Madame Dufresne, who had followed in a second carriage, came in behind her. She drew off the pelisse. She straightened the gold sash with a single touch. She lifted the loose curtain of red hair from one shoulder and let it fall to the other. She looked Miriam in the eye. "From here," Madame said, "you walk alone, down this corridor, to the head of the great staircase. You will see the ballroom below. You will not stop. You will not look down at your slippers. You will not look at any face but the face that is waiting at the foot of the stairs. Do you understand me, mademoiselle?" "Yes." "You wear no mask." "I know. Lord Marbury wears none either tonight. He has refused his. The house has remarked it." "I know." "Then go, mademoiselle. The hour has come." Miriam went. The corridor was short. The carpet was the color of dried blood. At the end of it, the gilt doors stood open upon the head of the great staircase. And beyond the staircase, 20 feet below, lay the ballroom of Devonshire House, lit by 5 chandeliers and 300 wax candles, and full of masked Englishmen and Englishwomen who had come this night to see and to be seen. She paused for a single breath in the dark of the doorway. The Verney signet at her throat caught the candlelight from the corridor sconces and burned for an instant like a small old coin. Then she stepped into the light. She did not see, at first, the heads that turned. She did not see the fan that froze halfway through its arc near the orchestra, nor the glass of champagne that paused on its way to a bishop's lips, nor the small wordless exhale of 100 women at once who recognized, all together, that something had entered the room which was not on any guest list. What she saw was the staircase, 20 broad, shallow marble steps, balustraded in white and gold, falling away beneath her feet, in a long, pale curve to the parquet below. She set her hand upon the rail. The rail was cold. Her hand did not tremble. The silk of the gown moved against her ankles like cool water, and the weight of the emeralds across her collarbone was the weight of every Marbury countess for 200 years coming home. She began to descend. She did not hurry. She did not look down at the steps. She had learned to walk down such a staircase at the age of 9 in a candlelit hall in Norfolk, with her father pacing beside her, counting under his breath, and her body remembered now what her mind had buried. Her shoulders were back, her chin was level. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead and a little above the crowd, upon a tall figure that stood, alone, at the foot of the stairs. He had no mask. He wore the severe, perfect black of his own house, the silver oak-leaf waistcoat catching candlelight along the embroidery, the cravat tied with the cold precision of a man who has been waiting a long time. His hair lay smoothly back from the high white brow. His gray eyes were lifted to the head of the staircase as though they had been lifted there for the entire previous hour. She saw the small thing first. His left hand, the one that had trembled at every state dinner since Ciudad Rodrigo, hung loose and steady at his side. Halfway down the stairs, the orchestra missed a note. The quadrille master, who had been about to call the next figure, opened his mouth and forgot what he had been about to say. A great Spanish dueña in black bombazine on the bottom step turned slowly and forgot to close her fan. The eyes of the room came up the staircase to meet her, every one of them, and for the space of 3 full breaths there was, in the great ballroom of Devonshire House, the rarest sound in all of London society. There was complete silence. She descended through that silence. She did not flinch from it. She gathered it about her shoulders like a cloak. At the 10th step, a young man in a domino of black and crimson took one involuntary step backward and trod upon the slipper of a marchioness behind him, and neither of them noticed. At the 7th step, Lady Jersey, who had been queening it by the great fireplace with a glass of negus in her hand, set the glass down without looking and let it tilt and spill upon the white marble of the mantel, and did not look. At the 5th step, the orchestra, leaderless, did not start again. At the foot of the stairs, the Earl of Alnwick lifted his eyes to her, and she saw, beneath the polished iron of his face, the small light shift of a man who has been keeping a vigil through a long winter and sees the first true sun. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved a single step forward, set his right hand at the base of the stairs upon the balustrade where her own hand would land at the bottom step, and waited. She came down the last 3 steps, and her hand met his. His palm was warm and dry. His fingers closed about hers with a controlled, steady pressure that was the pressure of a sworn oath made flesh. She felt, through her glove, the cold gold weight of the Alnwick signet upon his little finger. He felt, beneath his thumb, the small worn silver of the Verney crest where it lay upon the lace at her throat. He did not bow. He raised her hand and laid it formally upon his sleeve. He turned, with her at his side, to face the silent room. His voice, when at last he spoke, was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It carried in the silence like a bell over snow. "Good evening," the Earl of Alnwick said. "To my friends, may I present to you a lady whom many of you will not yet know by name." He paused. The pause was deliberate. The pause was the long, deep breath taken before stepping off a cliff into a sea one knows well. Across the room, beneath the great central chandelier, in pink saida and a white feathered mask, Cassandra Strickland had turned with the rest. She was holding the arm of a young hussar. She was laughing at something he had said. The laugh stopped halfway through her open mouth. She saw the green gown. She saw the loose red hair. She saw the parure of emeralds and diamonds across the throat of her own scullery maid. She saw the silver Verney signet lying above the green stones, and she could not, at that distance, read the small worn crest upon it. But her mind, with the merciless economy of the truly vain, supplied the explanation before the explanation was given. The color drained from her face beneath the rouge with such suddenness that the rouge stood out upon her cheeks like 2 painted spots upon plaster. Her mouth, still half open about the abandoned laugh, drew slowly into a small hard line. The white feathered mask, gripped in her right hand at the level of her hip, began to crumple between her fingers. Beside her, Sir Reginald, who had not yet seen what his daughter had seen, glanced at her and asked a sweating, affectionate question that did not penetrate. Lady Honoria, 3 feet away, lifted her lorgnette upon its long silver chain and trained it slowly across the room, along the line of every staring head, up the long curve of the staircase, and arrived at last upon the face of the woman at the Earl's side. The lorgnette did not move again. Behind it, Lady Honoria's small dark mouth opened and closed once, like a fish lifted from cold water. At the foot of the stairs, the Earl had not yet finished his sentence. He let the silence stretch one breath more, and then, with the smallest pressure of his right hand upon Miriam's gloved fingers, he resumed. "I shall not name her yet," he said, "for there is a matter of which I have spoken privately this past month with His Majesty's Lord Chancellor, which must be made plain in this room first, before she is named. I shall therefore beg of the orchestra one waltz, in which I may have the honor, before all London, of opening the floor with the lady upon my arm. After the waltz I shall speak." He turned his head, very slightly, toward the dais where the leader of the orchestra stood frozen with his bow upon the string. "Sir," the Earl said, in the same level carrying voice, "a waltz, if you please." The orchestra leader's bow descended. The first bars of a slow waltz lifted into the long-held breath of the room. The Earl turned to Miriam. He bowed, formally, deeply, from the waist, with the bow that one Englishman of his rank had bowed to no woman in 7 years. Then he stepped onto the parquet, drew her after him, and placed his right hand at the small of her back, exactly as a man places a hand on a thing that has been promised him in writing. She lifted her left hand to his shoulder. His left hand took her right. The cold weight of the Alnwick signet against her glove was now answered by the cold weight of the Verney signet against the lace at her throat, and the 2 metals rang together in some inaudible chord that only she and he could hear. He stepped. She followed. They turned, once, twice, beneath the great central chandelier of Devonshire House, and the candlelight slid across the deep green silk and along the diamond rivers at her throat and into the polished black of his coat, and the hussars and the marchionesses and the bishops and the dowagers stood about the painted edge of the parquet in a perfect unbroken ring and did not move, and the music carried on without anyone breathing. 3 turns into the waltz, Cassandra Strickland's white feathered mask snapped completely in two between her clenched fingers, and the pieces fell, unnoticed by her, to the parquet at her feet. Across the floor, the Earl looked down at Miriam, and Miriam looked up at the Earl, and neither of them smiled, because what was in their 2 faces was older and graver than smiling. The waltz turned them slowly past the great fireplace, past the orchestra, past the line of Stricklands beneath the chandelier, past Lady Jersey with her spilled negus, past the open doors of the supper room where 2 footmen had forgotten the trays in their hands. At the far end of the room, alone in the deep window bay between 2 velvet curtains, an old man in a black coat of antique cut leaned on a silver-headed cane shaped like a fox. Lord Bridges had come, after all. His half-moon spectacles caught the candlelight and hid his eyes, but his thin white mouth was set in something that, on a younger face, would have been a smile, and was, on his, more like the long, slow exhalation of an old soldier seeing a flag he has been waiting to see raised at last upon a captured wall. The waltz turned. The room turned with it. Somewhere on the edge of the parquet a fan, dropped at last by a frozen hand, struck the floor with a small, clear wooden sound. And under the great chandelier, in pink sedah streaked now with the sweat of pure rising hatred, Cassandra Strickland drew the broken halves of her mask together in her 2 fists, raised her chin, and began, with a small fixed smile upon her painted mouth, to walk slowly, deliberately, through the parted ring of guests, out onto the parquet of the open floor, toward the center, where the Earl of Alnwick and his unnamed lady were dancing their first waltz alone. The musicians, who had been holding a long, suspended cord at the conductor's raised hand, let the cord die at last. It did not end. It thinned, the way a held breath thins, until only the harpsichord's last note remained, and even that fell out of the air. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the small, brittle tap of Cassandra Strickland's slipper on the parquet. She came on alone. 100 masked faces turned with her, slowly, like flowers turning to a strange new sun. The great chandelier above the center of the floor poured its yellow light down upon the cleared circle, and into that circle Cassandra walked with the broken halves of her mask held together in 2 white-knuckled fists, the pink sedah of her gown trembling at the hem with each small step. The Earl had stopped. Miriam had stopped with him. His gloved hand was still upon her waist, hers still resting upon his sleeve. Neither of them turned to face the approaching girl. They stood as they had stood at the close of the waltz, a single shape under the luster, and they only watched. Lady Honoria by the pillar did not move. Sir Reginald, near the card-room arch, lifted his glass of claret halfway to his red mouth and forgot to set it down. Lord Bridges, near the long window, leaned upon the ebony cane with the silver fox head, and his pale blue eyes narrowed once. Cassandra reached the edge of the parquet, where the polished boards met the broad carpet. She did not step onto the carpet. She stopped, and she let the broken mask fall. It struck the floor and split entirely. A small white plume drifted from it and settled in the wax shine. "Stop her," Cassandra said. The word carried. She had been bred for ballrooms, and her small, high voice cut the marble air more cleanly than any shout. Heads turned that had not turned for the dance. "Stop her," she said again, and now she raised one trembling hand and pointed, not at the Earl, but at Miriam. That necklace upon her throat, that necklace is mine." Madame Dufresne, from her place near the alcove curtain, did not stir. Her dark eyes only narrowed by the smallest fraction, the way the eyes of a fencing master narrow when an opponent commits. The Earl did not turn his head. His gray eyes remained upon Miriam's face. His thumb moved, once, against the inside of her waist, a small private pressure. Cassandra took one step onto the carpet. "It was taken," she said, and her voice climbed. "From the cabinet in my mother's dressing room. 3 nights ago, the lock was forced. The household knows it. The household has spoken of nothing else." End quote. The household, of course, had spoken of no such thing. There had been no cabinet, no lock, no theft. There had been, 3 nights ago, a small French clock in that dressing room, and a sleeping girl in pink curl papers, and nothing more. But Cassandra had said it, and around the cleared circle, a dozen masked mouths drew breath in the same instant, and the breath of those dozen carried to the next dozen, and the lie was already moving outward from her, in rings, the way a stone moves rings outward upon a still pond. And the gown, Cassandra said. She drew a thin, fast breath. The gown was promised to me, by Madame Dufresne, for this very night. I came in pink, because the green was stolen also. A small sound, almost a laugh, rose somewhere in the gallery above. It was cut off at once. The chandelier creaked, very softly, as the air shifted. The Earl had still not turned. Miriam, beneath the great parure, felt the cold weight of the diamonds and emeralds upon her collarbone, and felt also, through the silk of her glove, the steady warmth of the Earl's hand at her waist. She did not look at Cassandra. She looked, instead, at the carpet between them, at the woven crimson and gold, at the small worn spot where some long-ago Devonshire heel had rubbed the pile thin. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, what was being attempted. The girl meant to break the moment. The girl meant to break it before the Earl could speak. The girl meant to fix the story of this ball, in the mouths of 100 witnesses, before a single name could be restored. It was, Miriam thought, a precise, elegant lie. It was also a stupid one. She lifted her face at last and looked at Cassandra full on, and Cassandra, who had expected tears, met instead the level moss-green gaze of a woman who had spent 2.5 years stooping in the corridor of the Strickland house, and had, in those corridors, learned every weak floorboard of the family from underneath. Cassandra's small mouth tightened. "Take it off her," she said, to no one in particular, to the air. "Take it off her this instant." No one moved. The Earl's silence had a weight of its own now. It was a silence the room had begun to feel along its skin. Pemberton, who had come 3 paces forward at the edge of the alcove and now stood with his white-gloved hands folded behind him, did not breathe. Madame Dufresne's fingers, hidden in the folds of her gray skirt, had closed about the small steel ring of her scissors and held them. Cassandra came another step onto the carpet. She was very near now. Miriam could see the rough little patch of paste rouge upon her left cheek where the carmine had been laid too thick, and the faint sheen of perspiration along her upper lip. Cassandra had a small smile fixed upon her painted mouth, the smile she used in church. "Thief," Cassandra said, soft and clear. The word traveled. A young man near the orchestra pit, in a black silk mask and a Brutus crop, repeated it under his breath, "Thief." And the woman at his elbow, who had been Cassandra's schoolfellow at Bath, said it after him. The word went out along the gallery rail in small, pale repetitions, and from the gallery rail it came down again upon the floor, like fine dust falling. The Earl's hand upon Miriam's waist did not move. His gray eyes did not move, but within the cuff of his coat, hidden against his hip, Miriam felt the very faintest tremor at last set in along his wrist, the old tremor from Ciudad Rodrigo that he had carried home from the peninsula and had never let any drawing-room see. He did not turn to comfort her. He did not turn to silence the girl. He waited. He was waiting. Miriam understood. For her. He was waiting, as he had waited for 9 months, to see what she would do. She drew one slow breath. She did not unclasp her hand from his sleeve. She did not step away. She only turned her head, by a small precise angle, and faced Cassandra Strickland directly across the 4 feet of carpet that lay between them, and waited. Cassandra struck. The slap came from her right hand, open, hard, with the full weight of her thin shoulder behind it. The sound of it was very small in that great room, a single dry crack, no louder than a snapped fan. It caught Miriam high upon the right cheek, just under the bone. The force of it turned her face a quarter to the left, toward the long mirror upon the eastern wall, and in that mirror Miriam saw, for an instant, her own pale face print itself, the red shape of a small hand, already rising beneath the porcelain skin. The whole room saw it too. A woman in a pearl-gray domino, near the pillar, gave a single sharp gasp and put her gloved knuckles to her mouth. Sir Reginald Strickland's claret, forgotten in his hand, tilted, and a thin, dark thread of wine slid down the side of the glass onto his nankeen breeches. He did not feel it. Lady Honoria's lorgnau dropped from her fingers and swung once on its long silver chain and struck the pillar with a small, clean note like a bell. Miriam did not cry. She did not lift her hand to her face. She did not look at the Earl. She did not look at the mirror. She let the heat of the slap settle into her cheek and waited until she could feel each separate finger mark within her skin, and then, very slowly, she turned her face back. She turned it not with a flinch, but with the same precise rotation a swordsman uses when he resets the guard. Her chin came up. Her moss-green eyes settled upon Cassandra's small blue ones and stayed there. It was, every witness afterwards swore, the look of a man in the House of Lords. Several of the older guests, who had known the late Viscount Verney in his own day at the despatch box, felt the recognition strike them in the chest before their minds had caught it. Lord Bridges, by the long window, closed his eyes for the briefest instant, as though something he had carried for 3 years had set itself down at last upon his shoulders and rested there. Miriam did not speak. She lifted, instead, her left hand. The white pelica glove came up slowly. 2 slender fingers found the high lace at her throat, just where the black ribbon ran beneath the diamonds. The fingers turned the ribbon out, gently, with the patience of a lady's maid undoing a tangled curl. From beneath the lace, from beneath the great parure of the Marburies, the small, heavy circle of silver came forth into the chandelier light and lay upon her breast. The Verney signet. It was no larger than a guinea. The Verney griffin was cut deep into its face, worn smooth at the edges by 3 generations of thumbs, blackened in the grooves. It hung from a plain black ribbon, the kind a country curate's daughter might wear in mourning. Against the diamonds and the emeralds it looked very small and very poor. It was the loudest object in the room. A second silence fell, and this one was not the silence of music withdrawn. It was the silence of 100 people who had recognized something they had not been meant to recognize. The young man with the Brutus crop, who had repeated thief so easily, took half a step back into the crowd. The schoolfellow at his elbow lowered her eyes to the carpet. Cassandra saw the signet. She did not understand it. She had never been taught to read a signet. She had been taught to read a guest list. But she saw the way the older men along the wall went still. She saw Lord Bridges by the window. She saw, at the foot of the great staircase, an old Whig peer, in a black domino, lower his glass of negus and stare. She saw the change in the room as a swimmer sees a sudden drop in the water, and her small white throat moved once, swallowing. "You see," she said, too loudly. "You see, she even wears stolen plate upon her neck." It was a poor recovery. It struck the silence and went nowhere. The Earl's hand, at last, left Miriam's waist. He did it without haste. His gloved fingers slid back along the green silk and dropped to his side. He stepped, in one quiet movement, half a pace forward, so that he stood between Miriam and Cassandra, but not so far that he hid Miriam from any eye in the room. He stood as a man stands at the head of a column when the column halts. His shoulders did not lift. His chin did not lift. Only his gray eyes lifted, slowly, and fastened upon Cassandra Strickland's face. He did not speak. He did not need to. The room read his silence, as the room had read the slap. Cassandra's painted mouth opened, and closed, and opened again. She had a phrase prepared, and the phrase died upon her tongue. She glanced, helpless, sideways. Her mother, at the pillar, was looking at the parquet, as though the parquet had personally betrayed her. Her father, at the cardroom arch, had at last noticed the wine upon his breeches, and was dabbing at it with a square of yellow silk, and would not lift his head. Cassandra was alone upon the carpet. She turned, with a small instinctive flinch, toward Madame Dufresne, who stood by the alcove curtain in her cinder-gray wool. Madame Dufresne met the glance with the face of a woman who had been 40 years a modiste and had seen, in those 40 years, every sort of small criminal panic in every sort of well-bred girl. Madame Dufresne inclined her head, by perhaps half an inch, in a gesture that was not a curtsy to Cassandra Strickland. It was the gesture a juror gives at the close of evidence. Cassandra turned back. There was nowhere else to turn. The Earl had not moved. He was waiting still. He was waiting upon her, now, and she felt it. Every face beneath every mask was waiting upon her. She felt the weight of all of those waiting faces press upon her thin shoulders, and her knees, beneath the pink seta, began very slightly to shake. "My lord," she said. The 2 words came out higher and thinner than she had meant. She tried again. "My lord, I did not." She did not finish. The Earl, with the smallest inclination of his head, with the smallest gesture of 2 gloved fingers, indicated the parquet at his own feet. He did not say, "Kneel." He did not say anything. The gesture was a courtesy and an execution at once. Cassandra did not kneel. She was not yet ready, and the Earl, reading her, did not press. He let the gesture stand a long moment, and then he let it fall. He had laid the order. He had laid it before 100 witnesses. He had laid it without raising his voice. Whether she obeyed now or in 5 minutes or under the threat of a writ in the morning, The room had already seen the order, and the room would remember it. He turned then, by perhaps a quarter turn, not away from Cassandra but to bring Miriam back within the line of his shoulder, and he extended his arm. It was a small, formal gesture, the gesture a man uses to lead his lady from one room to another at a great occasion. Miriam laid her gloved hand upon his sleeve. They did not move, they only stood, the two of them, beneath the great chandelier, the green of her gown and the black of his coat, and the silver of the Verney sinnet upon her breast, and waited for what should come next. What came next was a small sound at the foot of the great staircase. Pemberton, by the alcove, did not move. Madame Dufresne, by the curtain, did not move. But the old Whig peer in the black domino at the foot of the stair had set his glass of negus very carefully upon the marble plinth, and was now coming forward upon the carpet, slowly, leaning slightly upon his stick. He came until he was within 4 paces of the cleared circle. There he stopped, and there, very deliberately, before 100 witnesses, he bowed. It was not a ballroom bow. It was the bow that one peer of the realm gives to the daughter of another peer of the realm, and he gave it to Miriam. He held it the full count of 3. When he straightened, he did not look at Cassandra Strickland. He did not look at the Earl. He looked at Miriam alone, and he said, in a quiet voice that nevertheless reached the gallery, "Miss Verney." The name fell into the silence and stayed there. Around the cleared circle, slowly, like wheat bending in a passing wind, other heads inclined. They did not all incline. Some of the younger debutantes only stared. Some of the matrons turned aside to whisper behind closed fans. But enough heads inclined to be seen and counted, and Sir Reginald Strickland, who had at last lifted his red face from the spoiled breeches, saw them and went the color of cold tallow. Cassandra heard the name Verney. She did not know what it meant. She had been told, since she was 12, that the Verneys were a small, extinct family whose disgrace was no longer mentioned in polite houses. Her mother had said so, once, at breakfast, over the chocolate pot. She had not asked further. Now, hearing the old peer say the name, hearing the small grave bows of the older guests, watching her own father go the color of tallow against the card-room arch, she understood at last, dimly, the way an animal understands weather, that something very large had moved in the room, and that she was standing under it. She took one small backward step. The pink slipper struck the edge of the carpet behind her, and she half stumbled and recovered. The Earl, very quietly, spoke for the first time. "Madam," he said, and it was Cassandra he addressed, "you will remain where you stand." It was not a shout. It was the voice he had used to a regiment in the rain at Ciudad Rodrigo. Cassandra remained where she stood. Her thin hand, the one that had struck Miriam, hung loose at her side, the small fingers trembling against the pink seda. The Earl did not look at her again. He looked, instead, past her, toward the long doors of the inner saloon. From the inner saloon, at that moment, 2 black-coated men were coming forward. They wore the plain, unliveried black of men of business. One carried, in a leather portfolio under his arm, a thick set of folded papers tied with red tape. They came as far as the edge of the carpet and stopped, and bowed to the Earl, and waited. Pemberton, at the alcove, came forward also, by exactly 3 paces, and stopped, and waited. Madame Dufresne, at the curtain, did not move, but the small steel ring of her scissors, hidden in her hand, came at last out of her hand, and dropped into the pocket of her gray wool apron with a small dry click that only she heard. The room understood, without being told, that the Earl had been holding more than one card, and that the cards were now to be laid. Miriam, beneath the periquer, beneath the steady warmth of the Earl's sleeve under her gloved fingers, felt the heat of the slap upon her cheek begin at last to fade. In its place, slowly, beneath her stays, beneath the cold weight of the diamonds, the silver signet of the Verneys lay against her skin and warmed. She did not look at Cassandra Strickland. She looked, instead, at the Earl's profile, at the small white scar along his jaw, at the steady gray eye that did not turn to her for reassurance and did not need to. She thought, very clearly, of her father. She thought of the day, in the spring of her 15th year, when the carriage had come for him at the Verney house in Cavendish Square. She thought of the way he had stooped to kiss the top of her head before he climbed into it, and of the way he had said, against her hair, "Whatever they say of me in the next hours, remember that the name is older than the slander, and the name will keep." She had been a child then. She had not understood. She had wept for a fortnight afterwards into the pillow at her great-uncle's house in Bloomsbury, and the name had not kept, and the slander had eaten the name, and the Verney house in Cavendish Square had been sold to a brewer from Southwark within the year. Now, beneath the great chandelier of Devonshire House, the name was being said aloud again by a Whig peer in a black domino, and 100 masked faces were inclining toward it, and the slander was at last about to be eaten in its turn. She did not weep. She tightened, very slightly, her gloved fingers upon the Earl's sleeve. He felt the small pressure. He did not turn, but the tremor in his hidden wrist, the old tremor from Ciudad Rodrigo, eased at last, and did not return. Cassandra, still standing alone upon the carpet, lifted her painted mouth one final time. "My lord," she said, and her voice was thin now, and very young. "There has been a misunderstanding. The necklace—" "Madam," the Earl said without turning, "you will not speak of the necklace again this night." She closed her mouth. She closed it on the small remaining shreds of her plan, and the small remaining shreds of her bridal night, and the small remaining shreds of every breakfast conversation her mother had ever made over the chocolate pot about the future Lady Marbury of Alnwick. The shreds went down her throat dry and stayed there. The Earl, at last, moved. He turned, by a quiet half-step, so that Miriam moved with him. He did not lead her away. He led her, instead, 2 paces forward, toward the center of the cleared circle, into the full pour of light from the great chandelier. He stopped there. He set her where every eye in the room could see her. He let his hand drop again to his side. He waited. He waited, and the room understood that the Earl of Alnwick had finished with the small matter of the slap, and the smaller matter of the lie, and that the larger matter, the matter that had brought him through 9 months of secret carriages and lawyers' chambers and contracts signed at 3 Candles in Bloomsbury, was now to begin. Sir Reginald Strickland, against the card-room arch, drew out a square of yellow silk to wipe his forehead, and found that his hand would not steady enough to hold it. Lady Honoria Strickland, at the pillar, did not lift her lornhow from where it lay against her bosom. Cassandra Strickland, alone upon the carpet, did not move, and did not speak, and did not weep, only stood, the broken halves of her white mask at her feet, the print of her hand still cooling upon another woman's cheek. Above them, the 5 great chandeliers of Devonshire House burned on. Beneath them, in green silk and the parure of the Marburys, with the small silver signet of the Verneys lying open at her breast, Miriam stood with her chin level and her gloved hand upon the sleeve of the man she had not yet been heard, by this room, to call her own. She did not know, yet, what he would say next. She knew only that he would say it, and that she would stand where she stood while he said it, and that for the first time in 7 years the name her father had pressed into her hair was about to be spoken back to her under a chandelier rather than over a sewing candle. The Earl drew, very quietly, one slow breath. Behind him, at the edge of the carpet, the 2 black-coated men of business stood with the leather portfolio between them, and the red tape of the folded papers caught, very faintly, the yellow light. Pemberton, at 3 paces, did not move. Madame Dufresne, at the curtain, did not move. Lord Bridges, by the long window, did not move. Even the musicians in the gallery, who had let their last chord die so many minutes ago that the silence had become a piece of music of its own, did not move. The Earl turned his head, at last, by a small precise angle, and looked down at Miriam. He did not smile. He did not need to. His gray eyes held hers for the count of a single heartbeat, and in that single heartbeat he said, without words, the thing he had carried unspoken across 9 months of carriages and chambers and candles, and she understood it, and she returned it, with the same level gaze her father had once turned upon the despatch box of the house. Then the Earl of Alnwick lifted his face to the room, and opened his mouth to speak. His voice carried without effort. It did not need to rise. The acoustics of the Devonshire ballroom, built for orchestras and proclamations alike, gathered every syllable from the marble and returned it whole to the farthest gilded corner. "This lady," said the Earl of Alnwick, "is Miss Miriam Verney." The name struck the air like a struck bell. A small sound passed through the crowd. The sound of 100 indrawn breaths held a beat too long. Fans paused mid-flutter. A footman, halfway across the floor with a tray of orgeat, stopped where he stood. The orchestra had not resumed. The conductor did not lift his baton. He, like every other man and woman in that room, had become an audience. She is the only living daughter of the late Henry Verney, 4th Viscount Verney of Suffolk. He did not look at Cassandra. He did not look at Lord Strickland, who stood now with one fist white upon the back of a damask chair. He looked only at Miriam, and his gray eyes held hers as a man holds a rope across a flood. Miriam did not move. The print of Cassandra's hand still burned on her right cheek, a hot crescent the room could see, and pretended not to see. She did not lift her own hand to it. She did not lower her gaze. She stood beneath the great luster with her ruined name suddenly spoken in the open, and let it settle on her shoulders like a cloak she had been waiting 9 years to wear. The Earl turned then, by a quarter, so that the room might see his profile, and the room might also see the parchment that Pemberton placed into his gloved hand. It was not a small paper. It was a roll of vellum the length of a man's forearm, weighted at its tail by a disc of red wax the size of a crown coin, and from that disc dangled the silken cord and double seal of the Lord Chancellor of England. A woman near the orchestra made a small, helpless noise. "Master of ceremonies," said the Earl. Mr. Willoughby stepped forward. He was a thin man in puce satin who had introduced kings, and he had never in his life received a document under such a silence. He took the vellum in both hands. The cord swung. The wax struck softly against his cuff. "You will oblige me," said the Earl, "by reading it. From the salutation. Slowly. The whole of it." Mr. Willoughby's throat moved once. He unrolled the vellum, and the parchment made the small dry crack of an open decree. "To all, unto whom these presents shall come." His voice was thin at first. It steadied on the second line. "Whereas in the 3rd year of the reign of His present Majesty King George III, our right trusty and well-beloved Henry Verney, 4th Viscount Verney of the county of Suffolk, did suffer attainder upon a charge of high treason laid by petition before the House of Lords." The orchestra leader, very quietly, set his violin upon a chair. "And whereas a commission of inquiry, convened under the Great Seal at the express command of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, hath this 12th day of April, in the present year of grace, 1818, reported and certified upon oath that the said charge was procured upon false witness, suborned testimony, and forged correspondence." A small gasp, from somewhere by the orchid screen, stifled at once, and that the said false witness, suborned testimony, and forged correspondence were the work of 3 persons, whose names are herein set down, to wit. Mr. Willoughby paused. He did not wish to read the names. The Earl said nothing. The silence pressed him forward. "Sir Reginald Strickland, Baronet, of Grosvenor Square, in the city of Westminster." A sound went through the room, like wind through dry wheat. Sir Reginald's hand on the damask chair did not release. It only grew whiter. "The Honourable Mortimer Crewe, Member of Parliament for Pendlebury, deceased of fever in the year 1816, and one Josiah Pinchbeck, late of Cheapside, a tainted clerk, executed for unrelated forgeries in the year 1817. Mr. Willoughby lifted his eyes a fraction. He did not look at Sir Reginald. He looked at the vellum. Therefore, by the warrant of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, and under the hand of the Lord Chancellor of England, the attainder against the said Henry Verney, 4th Viscount Verney, is in all points reversed and annulled. The honour, dignity, and estates of the said Viscount are restored in full to his lineal heir. And it is hereby commanded that the name of Verney be entered anew in the roll of honour of this realm, and that all persons soever of whatever degree do henceforward give to the said heir such style and reverence as appertain to her rank. He let the vellum rest a moment against his chest. "Signed this day, by Hargrave, Lord Chancellor." He rolled the parchment closed. The red disc swung once and stilled. For perhaps 3 full seconds, the ballroom did not breathe. Then a single woman, somewhere in the gallery above, began very softly to weep. The Earl did not turn to look at Sir Reginald. He did not need to. The room had turned for him. 100 masked faces, painted swans and harlequins and shepherdesses, had pivoted by a small, careful degree, and now every one of them was looking at the corpulent man in the green coat by the damask chair, and at his wife in the plum satin who had begun very quietly to sink against the chair's arm. Lady Honoria's lorgnette slipped from her fingers. It struck the parquet with a thin musical chink that everyone heard. The Earl turned back to Miriam. He did not speak yet. Pemberton was already at his elbow with the second item. It was a small flat case of dark blue morocco, no larger than a prayer book, with the Marbury chevron stamped in dull gold upon the lid. The Earl took it. He did not open it at once. "Miss Verney," he said. His voice had altered. It was no longer the voice of the proclamation. It was quieter, and somehow it carried farther. "Will you permit me?" She inclined her head a fraction. Just a fraction. The room saw it, and the room understood that whatever happened next would happen by her leave. He opened the case. A ring lay upon the white velvet inside. It was not a new ring. The setting was old, a cabochon emerald the color of a cold sea, framed by 8 small diamonds in a worn gold collet, and any woman in that ballroom who had ever paged through the Burke would have known it on sight. "This is the betrothal ring of the Countesses of Alnwick," said the Earl, "for 7 generations. The last who wore it was my mother." He turned, and now for the first time he addressed the ballroom, but his eyes did not leave Miriam's face. 4 months ago in the city of London, at the house of Lord Augustus Bridges in Bloomsbury Square, I signed and witnessed by my own hand a contract of marriage with Miss Miriam Verney. The contract is lodged with Doctors' Commons and with my solicitors. It wants only the church and the ring. Tonight, with your leave, and before this company, I should be glad to set the ring upon her finger. He had not asked yet. He was asking now, with the case open between them and his right hand, the hand that for 3 years had not been still, held perfectly steady at his side. Miriam did not answer in words. She drew off the long creme glove from her left hand. She drew it off slowly, finger by finger, and the room watched the slow length of pale skin emerge and understood that this, too, was a kind of speech. When the glove was off, she let it fall against her skirt. She lifted her bare hand and offered it to him across the small open case. He took it. His fingers did not tremble. He set the cabochon emerald upon her 4th finger, above the knuckle, and pressed it gently home. The old gold caught the chandelier and threw back a small green spark. He bowed over her hand. He did not kiss it. Not here. The bow was deeper than protocol required, and the room read it. When he straightened, there was a soft sound from 100 throats at once, the sound a crowd makes when it has not been permitted to breathe, and at last is. Miriam lifted her chin 1 degree more and looked past his shoulder. Cassandra was standing where she had been standing, beneath the great luster, with her own torn pink mask hanging by its ribbon from one wrist. Her cheeks had gone the color of paper. Her small blue eyes flickered from the green ring to the vellum still in the master of ceremonies' hand to her father and back again to Miriam, and they did not seem to know where to settle. "You struck me," said Miriam. It was the first time she had spoken since she entered the ballroom, and her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The whole room had been built around it for the last quarter hour. "You struck me in front of this company, Miss Strickland. You called me a thief. You named the color of the petals on the gown you wore last Sunday. You named the position of the candle by which I sewed them. You knew the color and the candle because for 9 years you have eaten the bread that was bought with my father's stolen name, and you have made me sew the petals upon it." A small sound came from Cassandra's throat. It was not a word. "My lord," said Miriam, without turning her head, "what is the law upon the matter of a public charge of theft, falsely laid before 100 witnesses of rank, against the affianced wife of a peer of the realm?" The Earl answered her at once, and he did not lower his voice. "It is a slander actionable at common law. The damages, where rank is concerned, are exemplary. The proceedings are public, the sums are ruinous." "I see," said Miriam. She looked at Cassandra a long, quiet moment. "I do not wish to ruin a foolish girl," she said. "I wish her to ruin herself, in this room, by her own mouth, in the hearing of every person who watched her strike me. Miss Strickland, you will go to your knees. You will say, in a voice the gallery can hear, that you knew the necklace at my throat was not stolen, that you knew I am Miss Miriam Verney, that you struck me because for 9 years you have been afraid of the day this room would learn what you knew. You will beg my pardon. If you do not, you will leave this ballroom under the protection of no name worth carrying, and tomorrow morning every door in this city will be closed against you, and the morning after that the writ will be served. Choose now." Cassandra's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. She looked once at her father. Sir Reginald's red face had gone the color of tallow. His mouth worked. He gave her nothing. He could give her nothing. He was already, in the silence that pressed upon him from 100 sides, calculating his Newmarket book, and the second decree that he could feel rather than see in Pemberton's hand. Cassandra's knees folded. They did not fold gracefully. The pink taffeta crumpled about her in a sigh of crushed silk. She struck the parquet harder than she meant to, and a tiny sound of pain came out of her that the room ignored. "I knew," she said. The voice was thin. The Earl did not allow it. "Louder," he said. "The gallery cannot hear you." She tried again. The second time the voice climbed. "I knew the necklace was not stolen. I knew she was Miss Verney. I knew." I struck her because I was afraid. I beg her pardon. I beg her pardon. She said it a third time before she stopped, and the third time her voice broke, and the room watched without pity. Miriam looked down at her for the length of a slow breath. I accept the apology, she said. I do not accept the acquaintance. She turned her face away. It was done with that small turning. The room understood. From this night forward, in any drawing room in any of the 3 kingdoms, Miss Cassandra Strickland would be a woman whom the Countess of Alnwick had once known and did not know, and the doors would close one by one in a long, quiet sequence over the months to come. The Earl had already turned a quarter further. Sir Reginald did not lift his head. He had begun to perspire heavily. The lights of the great lustre had become for him a single white blur. My lord, he said. The word came out small. You will attend me, said the Earl, at my house in Berkeley Square, at 11 of the clock tomorrow morning. Pemberton will receive you. You will bring your man of business. You will bring the deeds to the property in Suffolk that you have held in trust under the false attainder of 1815. You will bring your book of accounts upon Newmarket from the Easter meeting of last year forward. I hold in my hand a second instrument under the seal of Coutts, by which the whole of your debt at the subscription rooms passed this morning into my private holding. I am presently your only creditor, Sir Reginald, and I am not a patient one. If you fail of the appointment, I will lay the entire of it before the bench at Westminster on Friday, and the entire of it before the editor of the Morning Post on Saturday. Do you understand me? Sir Reginald understood him. He made a small, thick sound that was not quite a word, and he bowed. The bow was the bow of a man whose knees did not entirely trust him. He did not lift his eyes from the parquet. Behind him, Lady Honoria had at last completed the slow, plum-colored sigh of a deliberate faint, and 2 unwilling matrons in dove gray were trying to lift her, without touching the salts that nobody had brought, and nobody hastened to help them. The Earl returned to Miriam. He set the empty morocco case into Pemberton's gloved hand without looking. Pemberton bowed and stepped back into the shadow at the edge of the dais where he had stood throughout. Pemberton's eyes, which had been impassive all his life, were not entirely impassive at this moment. He did not permit himself to smile, but his white side whiskers moved one small degree. The Earl offered Miriam his arm. She did not take it at once. She looked first to the gallery. In the gallery, in the second row of the southern balcony, leaning forward over the balustrade with both veined hands upon the silver fox-head of his cane, stood Lord Augustus Bridges. His white hair was a little disordered. His pale blue eyes were wet. He had taken off his half-moon spectacles and was holding them by one earpiece, and he was nodding, very slowly, the way a man nods when he has seen a long sentence at last come to its full stop. Miriam inclined her head to him. He inclined his to her. Neither of them attempted to smile. They had between them the understanding of 9 years of small lies in Bloomsbury, and the understanding required no more. Then she laid her bare left hand, with the green ring upon it, into the curve of the Earl's offered elbow. My lord, she said, very low, so that only he could hear, I believe the orchestra was about to play a waltz. They were, he said. Then we should not keep them. He bowed his head an inch. He turned with her, and they walked together to the center of the parquet, where Cassandra still knelt and where 2 footmen now came forward, by some small signal the room did not see, and very gently lifted the girl in pink to her feet and led her away toward a side door. She did not weep. She had nothing left to weep with. The door closed behind her with a sound no louder than the closing of a book. The Earl raised one gloved hand to the conductor. The conductor lifted his baton. The first 3 notes of the waltz fell into the room, and the room exhaled. He set his right hand at her waist. His thumb did not tremble against the green silk. He took her right hand in his left and lifted it to the height of his shoulder. He looked down into her face, and for the first time that night, his gray eyes were not the gray of cold steel, but the gray of a winter sky beginning to clear. Miss Verney, he said. My lord, you did not flinch. No, my lord. You will permit me to admire that for the rest of my life. She did not answer in words. She tilted her face up half an inch, the smallest possible adjustment, and her green eyes met his with a quiet that was not at all submission, and his hand tightened at her waist, and the music caught them, and they began to turn. They turned the first circuit alone. This was the courtesy of the room. No other couple stepped forward. The 5 great lustres burned white above them, and the parquet shone like a frozen lake, and the parure of the Marburys burned cold green and white fire at Miriam's throat as she moved, and her ruined cobweb of hair, which Dufresne had braided through with seed pearls in the alcove an hour before, threw small points of light with every turn. On the second circuit, the Earl of Salisbury led his wife in. On the third, 4 more couples. By the fourth, the parquet was crowded, and the orchestra had lifted into the full of the waltz, and the Devonshire ballroom on the second Wednesday of April, in the year 1818, had become, by silent vote of every person present, the ballroom that had witnessed the restoration of the House of Verney. Sir Reginald Strickland did not see the second circuit. He had been quietly conducted out by his own footman, his green coat damp at the collar. Lady Honoria had been carried after him in the arms of a porter. The pink taffeta had vanished. None of the 3 would be received at Almack's after that Friday. By June, the family had retired to a small property in Lincolnshire. By Michaelmas, the property had been sold to meet the Earl's note. But that was the slow business of months, and on the night of the mask it was only known that the music played and that the ruined ginger-haired girl in the green silk had become, by the end of one circuit, the most looked-at woman in England. The summer of that year was a slow gold. By the end of April, the banns had been read at St. George's, Hanover Square, and on the second Saturday of May, the Earl of Alnwick was married to Miss Miriam Verney, restored Viscountess in her own right, in a ceremony that the bishop himself conducted and that the Prince Regent, who did not often trouble himself with such things, signified by sending a basket of white roses from Carlton House. Miriam wore ivory silk. She wore the Marbury parure. Upon her left hand, the green cabochon emerald sat above a thin gold band, and within the band, engraved so small that only the wearer would ever know, were the words, "I saw you first." The wedding breakfast was given at Devonshire House. Through the months that followed, the Earl took his Countess everywhere he had once gone alone. He took her to the opera in a gown of garnet velvet with the Marbury rubies at her throat. He took her to Almack's in pale blue gauze with diamonds threaded through her hair. He took her to St. James's in court mantua of cloth of gold, and the Queen, who had a long memory, kissed her upon both cheeks and called her by her father's title. The drawing-rooms of London, which had for 9 years pretended that Henry Verney had never existed, now competed for the honor of receiving his daughter. The competition was not won by any of them. The Countess of Alnwick accepted the cards she chose, returned those she did not, and her choices were known within a week and obeyed within a fortnight. In late June, they went down to Alnwick Hall. The hall sat at the edge of a beech wood in Norfolk, 3 hours from the sea, a long, low house of warm yellow stone built in the reign of Queen Anne. The rose garden lay on the south front. It had been planted by the 3rd Countess of Alnwick a century before, and it had been kept since by the same family of head gardeners through 4 generations. And in late June, the white roses came in such profusion that the air at the far end of the long walk was thick and sweet enough to slow the step. Miriam walked there often in the early morning. She wore a gown of soft yellow muslin, very simple, with a straw bonnet trailing pale green ribbons, and over her bare hand she had taken to wearing the green emerald above the glove, in defiance of every rule of fashion, because she liked to see it in the sun. Pinned at her bodice, where for 9 years it had been hidden under fitted wool by a length of black ribbon, was the silver signet of the Verneys. She had had Madame Dufresne sew it openly into the lace. The Earl came down most mornings to find her there. His right hand, which for 3 years had not been still, had been still now for many weeks. He did not speak of it. He did not need to. She had laid her bare palm over the back of it on the night of the mask, and she laid it there often still, and the tremor had quietly understood that it was no longer required. On a Sunday morning in early July, she stood at the south end of the long walk, where the roses arched in a great pale tunnel over the gravel, and she heard his step behind her and did not turn. He came up to her shoulder and stopped. "I have been thinking," he said, "of the night I first saw you, at Lord Bridge's house in Norfolk. In the winter garden, you were standing by the camellias. You did not know I was there. You watched me a long time before you spoke. I watched you the length of one breath," he said. "Then I knew. The rest of the time, I was finding the courage." She turned then, and the white roses framed her face, and the green ring caught the morning. "My lord," she said, "what was it that you knew?" He did not answer at once. He lifted her bare left hand, the hand with the ring above the glove, and he set it against his own cheek, where the small old scar caught the light. "That you were the only one," he said, "who had ever truly seen me." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright, but they did not spill. "My lord," she said. "Oswald. Oswald." The roses moved a little in a small wind off the beechwood. A blackbird, somewhere in the topiary, began to sing. She had spent 9 years stitching petals onto another woman's gowns by the light of a tallow candle, with a silver signet cold against her ribs and her name unspoken in any room she entered. She had not wept once. She had not begged once. She had carried the ring beneath her dress and the name beneath her tongue, and she had waited. She had been seen. That, in the end, was the whole of the matter, and the whole of the matter was enough. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever, like Miriam, carried the truth of who you are, hidden against your skin, while the world insisted you were nothing? Has there been a moment when a single unmasking under bright light restored what years of silence had stolen from you? And do you believe that the people who recognize you in your plainest dress are the ones who will still know you in emerald silk? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about restored dignity, public justice, and quiet love that waits in silence, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.